Hello, everyone. I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now, get comfortable and relax. The old house breathes at night. I don't mean this metaphorically, I mean the walls physically expand and contract in the darkness. Wood creaking like arthritic joints, plaster exhaling dust that hangs suspended in moonlight. My grandmother's house has always done this, but now that I live here alone, the breathing sounds deliberate, conscious watching. I inherited this place 3 months ago after my grandmother passed. At 21, with nowhere else to go after dropping out of college and my ongoing battle with depression, it seemed like the universe offering a solution. A quiet rural property, no rent to worry about, isolation to sort myself out. The perfect retreat from the catastrophe my life had become. But isolation breeds its own monsters. The first time I saw them was exactly 2 weeks after moving in. I'd fallen asleep on the couch downstairs. I avoided the upstairs bedrooms, especially my grandparents' old room, and woke abruptly at 2:57 a.m. My body felt lean pinned to the cushions by some invisible weight. The living room was bathed in blue television static, though I was certain I'd turned it off before drifting to sleep. And there in the far corner, something moved. Not the casual shifting of shadows cast by trees outside the window, but something with purpose. A dense patch of darkness with greater depth than the surrounding dimness. It stood roughly 6 feet tall, vaguely human, shaped but without distinct features, just a hole in reality that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. My breath caught in my throat, lungs struggling against ribs that suddenly felt 2 sizes too small. The figure remained motionless for perhaps 10 seconds before sliding, not walking, behind the china cabinet. My muscles finally unlocked and I scrambled for the light switch. Hard hammering so violently I could feel my pulse in my eyeballs. The room fully illuminated was empty. I convinced myself it was sleep paralysis, a common enough occurrence for someone with my psychological profile. The medication I'd been prescribed often caused vivid dreams. After all, I managed to calm myself through rational explanations, though I slept with every light in the house blazing that night. The next morning, I noticed 3 long scratches on the wooden floor exactly where the shadow had stood. After that first night, the occurrences fell into a pattern. Always at 3:10 a.m., always preceded by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow even the constant background hum of the refrigerator. Doors would slam upstairs though there was no wind. Footsteps creaked along the hallway outside my room. And the shadows, always the shadows gathering in corners, slipping behind furniture standing at the foot of my bed. I began leaving my laptop open and recording through the night. The footage showed nothing but occasionally jumped and distorted at precisely 3:00 a.m., the timestamp freezing for exactly 7 minutes before resuming normal recording. During those missing minutes, objects in my room would be slightly displaced. A book moved from desk to floor. My shoes arranged neatly when I'd left them scattered, the shower curtain closed when I'd left it open. My psychiatrist increased my medication when I mentioned these occurrences during our video session. He suggested my depression was manifesting as paranoid ideation, that isolation was amplifying my symptoms. He recommended I find a roommate or consider moving back to the city. But even through the chemical haze of increased medication, the 3:00 a.m., visitations continued growing more intrusive. The shape at the end of my bed would lean closer night by night. I began feeling cold fingers tracing patterns on my back when I tried to sleep. Once I woke to find all the framed family photos turned to face the wall, I researched obsessively. Sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning. But the CO detector showed normal levels, and I began setting alarms to ensure I was fully awake at 3:00 a.m. Yet still, the phenomena continued. Then I found the YouTube video. It appeared in my recommended feed after weeks of searching for explanations of shadow people, a grainy amateur production titled Contacting Jinn. Shadow People Dangerous Ritual Captured. Normally I would have scrolled past such obvious clickbait, but the thumbnail showed a shadowy figure identical to what I'd been seeing. The video featured a bearded man in his 30s performing what he claimed was an ancient summoning ritual. He explained that jinn entities from Middle Eastern and Islamic mythology were beings of smokeless fire that could appear as shadows and attach themselves to locations and people. According to his rambling explanation, they were attracted to negative energy, particularly depression and isolation. My fingers trembled as I recognized my exact situation in his description. The ritual itself seemed absurdly simple. At midnight, place a black candle before a mirror, extinguish all other lights, and recite a string of words 3 times. The video creator warned viewers never to actually perform the ritual, claiming it had caused terrible consequences in his own life. I should have heeded the warning, but desperation makes fools of us all. That night I gathered the materials. My hands shook as I positioned my bathroom mirror on the coffee table, placing a black candle I'd found in my grandmother's box of emergency supplies directly in front of it. At midnight, I extinguished all lights, my face ghoulish in the candlelight reflection. The words came out stuttered at first, then stronger with each repetition. Nothing happened during the recitation. No sudden wind, no temperature drop, no dramatic flickering of the candle flame, just my own pathetic reflection, staring back hollow-eyed and gaunt from weeks of disturbed sleep. Disgusted with myself for falling for internet nonsense, I blew out the candle and went to bed swallowing an extra sleeping pill for good me assure. At exactly 3:00 a.m., I woke to find myself unable to move, paralyzed, as though massive hands pressed me into the mattress. The darkness in the corner of my room was deeper than usual, more substantial. As I watched frozen in terror, it formed into a humanoid silhouette that approached with fluid, inhuman movements. "We've been waiting for you to invite us, properly," a voice whispered directly into my mind. It wasn't audible. Rather, the words formed in my consciousness as though they were my own thoughts, but with an alien resonance that sent ice through my veins. The pressure on my chest increased until breathing became a conscious labor. Sweat drenched my body despite the sudden, unnatural cold that filled the room. The shadow entity, the jinn, leaned closer, its featureless face now inches from mine. "This house remembers things you don't." With those words, memories that weren't mine flooded my mind. My grandmother as a young woman performing rituals in the basement, drawing symbols on the floor that matched those in the YouTube video. My grandfather building this house on land where terrible things had happened long before. Promises made, bargains struck, protection purchased through sacrifice. The shadow entity pulled back and I gasped as the pressure lessened enough for me to draw full breath. It moved toward my bedroom door, its form rippling like smoke underwater. "Follow if you wish to understand." Against every instinct of self-preservation, I rose from the bed on trembling legs. My body felt simultaneously lean and disconnected, as though I was piloting it from a distance. The hallway outside was impenetrably dark, yet the shadow was somehow still visible, gliding toward the attic stairs I had never dared to climb. Each step creaked beneath my weight as I followed, my breathing shallow and rapid. My heart pounded so violently I felt lightheaded, the rush of blood in my ears almost drowning out the whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. My mouth had gone desert dry, my tongue sticking to the roof as I tried futilely to swallow. The attic door hung open, though I knew I had sealed it shut with packing tape my first week in the house. From inside came a faint bluish glow that reminded me of the television static from my first encounter. The shadow entity waited just beyond the threshold, somehow taller now, its form stretching, until it nearly touched the sloped ceiling. Behind it, I could make out shapes. Other shadows moving independently of any light source, gathering around something on the floor. Your grandparents understood the old ways. They maintained the balance. In the center of the attic floor was a perfect circle drawn in what looked like ash, containing intricate symbols I couldn't comprehend, but somehow recognized from the memories that had been forced into my mind. The patterns throbbed with meaning, sending waves of nausea through me, as my perception tried to accommodate concepts it wasn't designed to process. The entity gestured toward the circle and the memory knowledge surfaced again. This house stood on a thin place, a boundary where the veil between worlds stretched translucent. My grandparents hadn't built their home here by accident. They had been caretakers maintaining ancient wards against something that pressed constantly against that membrane, hunting for weaknesses. When they died, the protections began to fail. The shadow entities, the jinn, weren't attacking me. They were warning me. The ritual I had performed based on the YouTube video's corrupted information hadn't summoned them. It had weakened the last barriers, holding back something far worse. As this understanding crystallized, the floorboards beneath the circle began to bulge upward, wood splintering as though something pushed from below. The shadow entities moved restlessly, their forms becoming more agitated as the bulge grew more pronounced. The bargain must be renewed. The price must be paid. My legs nearly buckled as comprehension dawned. The price wasn't death. It was service. Guardianship. My grandparents had committed their bloodline to maintaining the boundary, and in my ignorance I had almost unleashed whatever lurked on the other side. The main shadow entity approached, extending what might have been a hand. It didn't speak again, but I understood the choice being presented. Take up my inherited responsibility, or leave the barrier to fail entirely. My depression suddenly seemed trivial compared to the cosmic obligation before me. In that moment, I realized my grandmother's insistence that I visit often her strange lessons about the house's personality. Her deathbed whispers I had dismissed as delirium, all had been attempts to prepare me. With shaking hand, I reached toward the entity. The moment we connected, searing pain shot up my arm as knowledge flooded my consciousness. Rituals, symbols, timings, warnings accumulated over generations. I understood now why my family had always seemed strange to outsiders. Why we kept to ourselves. Why this remote property had remained in our possession despite financial hardships. The bulge in the floor receded as the circle began to glow with renewed power. The shadow entities dispersed like smoke and wind, their purpose fulfilled. I stood alone in the attic, trembling with exhaustion and revelation. Dawn broke as I made my way downstairs, my mind reeling with new understanding and purpose. The house felt different now, not threatening, but expectant. I was no longer an intruder, but a caretaker. My phone buzzed with a notification. The YouTube video I had watched was gone, deleted by its creator. In its place was a private message. I see you've taken up the mantle. Welcome to the Guardians. You're not alone. The house breathed around me, but now I understood its language. I would learn to breathe with it. After all, some shadows protect us from darker things that wait beyond the light. Story 2. The old have wisdom that the young dismiss as superstition. I know better now. Some things lurk in the spaces between dreams and reality. Hungry things with patient smiles that wait for disbelief to create openings. My daughter's nightmares taught me this. Her tormentor came in azure hues and mocking laughter. And in the end, only faith, not reason, could drive it away. The first night it happened, I was jolted awake by Eliza's screams. Not the brief cry from a typical nightmare, but sustained primal terror that sent me running down the hallway, heart hammering against my ribs. I found her sitting upright, eyes wide open, but seeing something beyond the darkened walls of her bedroom. Her skin was slick with sweat, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. When I touched her shoulder, she flinched violently. She was here. Eliza whispered, her voice the blue woman. I assured her it was just a dream, nothing more. I checked her closet beneath her bed, behind the curtains, the routine of a father dispelling a child's nighttime fears, though my daughter was 22. When her breathing steadied, I left a glass of water on her nightstand and returned to my own disrupted sleep. The dream came again the next night, and the next. Eliza described an elderly woman with skin the color of a bruise, with spider-thin fingers, and a mouth that stretched too wide when she laughed. According to Eliza, this apparition would lean close and whisper, "Cover your head, little piggy," before reaching for her with those elongated fingers. The consistency of the details unsettled me. By the fifth night, dark crescent had formed beneath Eliza's eyes. She moved through our house like a ghost herself, starting at shadows, wincing at sudden sounds. I suggested a doctor, perhaps a sleep specialist. Eliza merely shook her head, saying they wouldn't understand. Her refusal frustrated me. I was an engineer, a man who believed in solutions in the measurable and explicable, yet my daughter's suffering had no schematic I could follow. That night, I decided to stay in her room, settling into the reading chair in the corner. Eliza fell into an uneasy sleep while I watched over her. A biography opened, but unread in my lap. The hours stretched. My eyelids grew heavy. I dozed. A sudden drop in temperature woke me. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. My breath fogged in front of my face, which made no sense. It was July in Arizona. I reached for the light switch, but my arm felt lean, unresponsive. A pressure had settled on my chest as though something heavy sat there. I could move only my eyes, which darted frantically around the darkened room. The moonlight filtering through the blinds cast striped shadows across Eliza's sleeping form. As I watched helpless in my paralysis, the shadows between the stripes of light seemed to deepen, to coalesce. A figure formed at the foot of her bed, hunched and thin. Though I couldn't see its face clearly, I knew it was smiling. It didn't move like a person. Its movements were jerky staccato, like film missing frames. One moment at the foot of the bed, the next leaning over Eliza, its face inches from hers. Its skin reflected the moonlight with a bluish tinge. I strained against my invisible bonds, my jaw clenched so tight I feared my teeth would crack. A high, thin humming filled the room, modulating into what sounded like laughter. The figure's head swiveled toward me, though its body remained bent over my daughter. I glimpsed a slash of white, its smile and roomy eyes that reflected no light. The pressure on my chest intensified. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. The thing's mouth opened wider than any human mouth should, and I heard a rasping whisper. "Cover your head, little piggy." I woke with a gasp, nearly falling from the chair. The room was normal. No cold, no pressure, no figure. The clock read at 5:42 a.m. Eliza slept peacefully for the first time in nearly a week. I rubbed my face, trying to make sense of what had happened. Sleep paralysis, I told myself. A waking nightmare triggered by stress and Eliza's suggestible stories. But when Eliza woke, she seemed different. The shadows beneath her eyes had darkened. Her movements were sluggish, her speech slightly slurred. She said she hadn't dreamed at all, but didn't seem rested. She claimed not to remember what the blue woman had said to her in previous dreams. This struck me as odd. She had been explicit about it before. That afternoon, I found Eliza staring blankly at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her hand tracing patterns on the glass that her reflection did not follow. When I called her name, she startled, then brushed past me without explanation. Later, I caught her whispering to herself in the kitchen, her lips forming words that looked like cover and piggy. And soon fear wrapped its cold fingers around my spine. I began to research night terrors, sleep disorders, even rare neurological conditions. I found nothing that matched Eliza's symptoms or the progression of her behavior. Desperate, I called my father, Eliza's grandfather, a retired pastor with whom I'd had little contact since my wife's death years before. Our relationship had been strained by my rejection of faith, my insistence on empirical evidence over biblical claims. But desperation breeds flexibility. My father listened without interruption as I described Eliza's nightmares, my own experience, and her deteriorating condition. His silence stretched so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, he spoke, asking if I remembered my Aunt Maria and my mother's sister who had died when I was young. I didn't. He described how she had suffered similar nightmares before her death dreams of a blue woman who whispered threats. I felt the blood drain from my face as he continued explaining that these visitations had been documented in our family for generations, always targeting those who had experienced profound grief. Eliza had never recovered from her mother's death. She carried that pain like a second shadow. My father's voice grew firm as he told me what needed to be done. A blessing, a ritual from the old country that predated even Christianity, though it had been wrapped in its trappings by our ancestors. He would come tomorrow. Until then, I was to place salt across Eliza's doorway and windowsills, and under no circumstances was I to fall asleep in her presence again. I wanted to dismiss his superstitions to cling to my rational foundations. But the memory of that blue-ted face hovering over my paralyzed form stripped away my certainty. I did as he instructed. That night proved the longest of my life. I sat in the hallway outside Eliza's room, back against the wall, fighting sleep. Every time my chin dropped to my chest, I would jerk awake, heart racing. Around 3 a.m., I heard Eliza talking, her voice alternating between her own and something higher, almost sing-gong. I pressed my ear to the door, but couldn't make out the words. When I tried the handle, it wouldn't turn. I called her name softly at first, then with increasing urgency. No response. I put my shoulder to the door twice before it gave way. Eliza sat cross-legged in the center of her bedhead, tilted at an unnatural angle, smiling at the corner of the ceiling. The salt line across the doorway was broken, scattered. I followed her gaze to the corner where shadows seemed to pulse and shift. Eliza, I said, my voice barely audible. She turned to me slowly, her smile too wide, her eyes unfocused. She says you're a little piggy too, Daddy, she said, but the voice wasn't entirely Eliza's. Little piggies need to cover their heads before the butcher comes. I crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing Eliza by the shoulders. Her skin felt cold, clammy. I shook her gently at first, then harder, when she continued to smile, that horrible stretched smile. Eliza snapped out of it. Her head lolled back, then forward. For a moment, her eyes cleared, filled with recognition and fear. Dad, she whispered, her own voice again. She's here. She's always here now. I held her close as she began to tremble, whispering reassurances I didn't believe. Over her shoulder, I saw the shadows in the corner deepen, taking on that familiar hunched shape. My throat constricted. My limbs grew heavy. The temperature in the room plummeted. I fought the paralysis with everything I had, focusing on Eliza's weight in my arms, the solidity of her presence. The shadow figure flickered, advancing with that jerky time-lapse movement. I dragged Eliza toward the door, my movements sluggish as though wading through molasses. The high, thin humming began again. We made it to the hallway. I slammed the door, knowing it wouldn't hold, knowing doors meant nothing to whatever this was. I half-carried Eliza downstairs to the kitchen, as far from her bedroom as we could get. She was more lucid now, but weak, barely able to stand. I sat her at the table and frantically called my father, the digital clock on the microwave showing 3:47 a.m. He answered on the first ring as though he'd been waiting. I didn't waste time with explanations. It's happening now, I said, my voice shaking. What do I do? My father's voice came clear and strong over the line. He told me to put him on speaker, then to find salt, rosemary from the spice rack, and any iron tool. I did as instructed, placing the phone on the table between Eliza and myself. As I searched for the items, the lights in the kitchen flickered. The humming grew louder. Eliza's eyes kept drifting to the doorway, widening with terror at something I couldn't yet see. I found rosemary, a cast iron skillet, and the salt I'd used earlier. My father began to recite something not in English, not in any language I recognized. The words sounded ancient, guttural. As he spoke, the air in the kitchen grew thick, charged like the moments before a lightning strike. The hair on my arm stood on end. The shadow appeared in the doorway, more solid than before. In the harsh overhead light of the kitchen, I could see it clearly for the first time. The blue woman. Her skin wasn't just tinged blue, but the deep azure of a corpse left too long in water. Her eyes were milky, her lips blackened. That too wide smile revealed teeth filed to points. She wore the tattered remains of what might have been a nightgown decades ago. "Cover your head, little piggy!" She rasped, her voice like nails on slate. "The butcher is hungry tonight." My father's voice grew louder through the phone. I fumbled with the salt, pouring a circle around Eliza, and myself nearly dropping the container when the blue woman took a stuttering step forward. The lights flickered more violently. The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the windows. My breath clouded before me. Eliza began to keen a high, frightened sound. The blue woman's form flickered like a television with poor reception. She advanced another step, then another. I raised the iron skillet knowing it was useless but unable to stand by without some attempt at defense. My father's chanting reached a crescendo. The blue woman stretched out those spider-thin fingers toward us, toward Eliza. And then between one heartbeat and the next, something changed. The air pressure shifted. The blue woman's form wavered, becoming less substantial. She opened her mouth in what appeared to be a scream, but no sound emerged. My father's voice cut off abruptly, replaced by his calm instruction to sprinkle the rosemary over Eliza's head, and then my own. I did so with shaking hands. The blue woman's form grew increasingly transparent, her movements more frantic. She lunged forward, passing through the salt line as though it weren't there. I swung the skillet, reflexively passing it through her insubstantial form. A cold so intense it burned washed over me. For a moment I felt her presence inside me. Ancient, malevolent, hungry. Then it passed, leaving me gasping. The blue woman stood at the edge of our table, her form barely visible now. She was no longer smiling. Her expression held something I never expected to see. Fear. "Finish it," my father said through the phone. "Say the words I taught you as a boy." I hadn't thought of those words in 30 years. The prayer my father had insisted I memorize. The one I'd rejected along with the rest of his faith. But they came to me now, rising from some deep recess of memory. Words of protection, of banishment. I spoke them, my voice growing stronger with each syllable. The blue woman writhed as though in pain. Her mouth opened in that silent scream again. Her form grew fainter still until she was just an outline, a suggestion in the air. With a final violent twist, she vanished. The light steadied. The temperature began to rise. Eliza slumped in her chair unconscious, but breathing steadily. My father was still on the line. He explained what I already knew, what I denied for decades. Our family had been haunted for generations by this entity. This blue woman who fed on grief and fear. She targeted those most vulnerable, inserting herself into their dreams. Then gradually into their waking world, the ritual he'd performed, the one my ancestors had passed down, was the only protection. I looked at Eliza's peaceful face. The first time I'd seen her truly at rest in weeks. I thought of my Aunt Marion, who had died without the protection of this ritual. I thought of my own stubborn denial of anything beyond the measurable, the rational, and how close that denial had come to costing me my daughter. My father arrived the next morning, bringing with him ancient books and family records, documenting encounters with the blue woman going back centuries. Together, we performed a more permanent version of the ritual, blessing every room in the house, every doorway and window. Eliza grew stronger by the hour, the shadows beneath her eyes gradually fading. She remembered little of her possession, for which I was grateful, but she remembered the dreams, the whispered threats. "Cover your head, little piggy," a warning my father explained. Not a threat. The entity had been giving away its own weakness, compelled by rules older than itself. Covering the head, a ritual protection that the entity itself couldn't help but reveal. I've made peace with my father and with the understanding that some things exist beyond the reach of science. Some nights I still wake at 3:17 a.m., my breath fogging in warm air, a pressure on my chest. But I know the words now. I've learned to believe. And when I speak them, the pressure lifts, the cold recedes, and I'm left in the comfortable darkness of an ordinary night. Safe from the things that smile from the corners of our perception, waiting for disbelief to create openings. The old have wisdom that the young dismiss as superstition. I am no longer young, and I am no longer foolish enough to disbelieve. Story 3. The forest doesn't breathe at night. That's what I first noticed when I moved to the cabin. The unnatural stillness that descends after sunset, as if the entire woodland holds its breath waiting. The daytime chorus of birds and rustling leaves gives way to a silence so complete it feels like pressure against your eardrums. You strain to hear something, anything to break the void. And when that something finally comes, a snap of a twig or the soft shuffle of movement just beyond your field of vision, you almost wish for the silence to return. I came to these woods to escape. The doctors called it acute social withdrawal syndrome, but I called it self-preservation. After 32 years of forcing smiles and meaningless conversations, something inside me simply broke. The cabin belonged to my uncle abandoned for years after he disappeared during a hunting trip. The family avoided discussing both him and the property, so when I mentioned wanting it, they practically signed over the deed that day, relieved to wash their hands of the place. The first 2 weeks passed in blessed isolation. I established a simple routine: gathering firewood in the morning, foraging for mushrooms and berries in the afternoon, and reading by lamplight until sleep came. No phones, no internet, no human contact. The persistent tightness in my chest began to loosen like a fist, slowly unclenching. I felt myself becoming part of the forest's rhythm until the night they appeared. I was returning from the creek with freshly filled water jugs when I spotted movement in the clearing ahead. 3 figures stood at the edge of the tree line, motionless, watching. The evening light caught them at an odd angle, casting elongated shadows that seemed disconnected from their forms. I froze, water sloshing in the container's heartbeat, suddenly loud in my ears. They weren't rangers. Their clothing looked handmade, oddly antiquated. Not hikers either, as they carried no gear. One raised a hand in greeting. The gesture was stiff, mechanical, as if they were unfamiliar with the motion. My throat constricted, but I managed to nod in acknowledgement. They approached with synchronized steps, moving together like a single organism. As they drew closer, I noticed something unsettling about their faces. A vague blurriness, as if I couldn't quite focus on their features, no matter how hard I tried. The tallest one spoke. Their voice sounded wrong, like air rushing through hollow wood, words flowing together without proper pauses for breath. They asked if I lived alone in the cabin. The question sent a cold trickle down my spine, but isolation had made me desperate enough for interaction that I didn't immediately retreat. I confirmed that I did, adding that I preferred the solitude. The trio exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that made my skin prickle with unease. They introduced themselves as fellow hermits who had been living deeper in the forest for a very long time. No names were offered, and I didn't provide mine. They suggested building a meeting place between our territory's neutral ground where we could occasionally gather. The proposal struck me as bizarre, yet I found myself nodding in agreement. There was something compelling about them, a gravitational pull I couldn't resist, despite the warning bells clanging in my head. For the next 3 days, we worked on constructing a simple shelter in a small clearing halfway between my cabin and where they claimed to reside. They brought materials I didn't recognize. Strange twisted branches and fibrous plants I'd never seen despite my daily exploration of the surrounding forest. Their building technique was peculiar. They never used tools, only their hands, which moved with unsettling precision. They worked primarily in silence, communicating through subtle gestures and expressions that were impossible to interpret. When they did speak, they asked questions about modern life with an odd detachment, as if discussing a foreign culture. They seemed particularly fascinated by technology, though they claimed to have no interest in returning to civilization. I found myself revealing more than I intended. Details about my breakdown, my family, my reasons for retreating to the woods. They absorbed every word with intense focus. Heads tilted at identical angles, never blinking quite often enough. At dusk on the 3rd day, the shelter was complete. A dome structure large enough for 4 people to sit comfortably, woven so tightly it seemed impervious to wind or rain. We stood back to admire our work as the last light faded from the sky. One of them suggested meeting again the following evening to make it properly ours. Before I could ask what they meant, they melted into the darkening forest with uncanny speed, leaving me alone with an inexplicable heaviness in the pit of my stomach. I slept poorly that night, plagued by dreams of roots growing through my body while I lay paralyzed. I woke repeatedly convinced I could hear breathing outside my window, only to find nothing but that oppressive silence when I gathered the courage to look. Morning brought a thick fog that clung to the ground like smoke. I delayed my visit to the shelter until mid-afternoon when the mist finally burned away. What I found stopped me dead in my tracks, the blood in my veins turning to ice water. The shelter, so meticulously constructed just hours before, was decaying before my eyes. The once sturdy branches had blackened and warped, dripping with a viscous fluid that resembled tar. Mushrooms sprouted from every surface. Not the familiar varieties I'd been foraging, but grotesque bulbous growths with pulsing red veins. The entire structure seemed to be breathing, expanding, and contracting almost imperceptibly. The air around it buzzed with flies, their bodies unnaturally large and iridescent. My rational mind grasped for explanations. Some type of rapid mold, perhaps, or a chemical reaction between different plant materials, but nothing could account for the scale of decomposition that should have taken months compressed into a single night. As I circled the shelter, my foot sank into the ground with a sickening squelch. The earth around the structure had turned to black mud, though there had been no rain. The smell hit me then. A putrid stench of rot so powerful it triggered my gag reflex. I stumbled backward, sleeve pressed against my nose, yet couldn't tear my eyes away from the abomination before me. That's when I noticed what appeared to be handprints pressed into the decaying walls from the inside, as if someone or something had been trying to claw their way out. Panic surged through me like an electrical current. I turned and ran crashing through underbrush, oblivious to the branches whipping against my face. My lungs burned and my legs trembled. But I didn't slow until I reached my cabin, slamming the door and throwing the bolt with shaking hands. As daylight waned, rational thought slowly returned. I convinced myself that my friends had played an elaborate prank, somehow accelerating the decomposition process with chemicals. I resolved to confront them the next day, anger temporarily overriding my fear. But as darkness fell, the forest silence took on a different quality, expectant like an audience waiting for a performance to begin. My skin tingled with the certainty of being watched. Every creak of the cabin's old timbers sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I sat rigid in my chair, eyes fixed on the door, a kitchen knife clutched in my sweating palm. Around midnight, the scratching started. Gentle at first, like tree branches against the walls, then growing more deliberate, slow, methodical scrapes moving around the cabin's perimeter. My breath came in shallow gasps, heart hammering so violently I feared it might burst from my chest. The temperature plummeted, my exhaled breath suddenly visible in the lamplight. The scratching stopped directly outside my window. I sat paralyzed, eyes wide, as a shadow gradually darkened the glass. Too tall, too thin to be human. A hand pressed against the pane. The fingers elongated and jointed in impossible places. Though I couldn't make out the figure's face, I felt its gaze boring into me with physical force rooting me to the spot. A voice drifted through the walls, that same hollow, breathless quality I'd heard before, but now distorted as if multiple voices spoke in imperfect unison. "We've been alone so long. Let us in. We want to wear you." The lamp flickered, shadows dancing across the walls. When the light stabilized, the window was empty. But the scratching resumed now at the door, accompanied by soft, insistent whispers too faint to decipher. The doorknob slowly began to turn, though I knew with certainty that I had bolted it. I broke from my paralysis, then scrambling to brace a chair under the handle. The whispering intensified, seeping through the cracks in the walls, filling the cabin with fragments of phrases that made no sense, yet filled me with unspeakable dread. Empty for so long. Need substance. Where are you from inside? Hours passed in a blur of terror, my sanity fraying as the assault continued. Sometimes the voices seemed to come from inside the cabin itself, hissing directly into my ears, though I was alone. The temperature continued to drop until frost formed on the inside of the windows. My muscles cramped from constant tension, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Just before dawn, everything stopped. The silence returned so abruptly, it felt like a physical blow. I remained frozen in place, afraid to trust the reprieve. As the first pale light filtered through the windows, exhaustion overcame fear, and I collapsed into a fitful sleep. I woke to bright midday sun and the distant call of birds. Normal forest sounds that seemed impossible after the night's events. For a moment, I wondered if I had dreamed the entire experience, a product of isolation and an overactive imagination. But the frost on the windows had left water stains as it melted, and deep scratches marred the door's exterior. When I finally worked up the courage to remove the barricade driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain, I returned to the site of the shelter. Nothing remained. Not the rotting dome, not the blackened earth, not a single unusual mushroom. The clearing looked undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been built there. I might have believed I was losing my mind if not for one detail. At the center of the clearing lay three small identical objects. Picking one up, I recognized it as a crude doll fashioned from twigs and mud with a lock of hair. My hair bound around its middle. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound, sleeping only in short, restless bursts. I considered leaving, but feared what might follow me back to civilization. Instead, I began researching the area's history, digging through my uncle's old papers, stored in the cabin's small attic. What I discovered chilled me more deeply than the entities themselves. Newspaper clippings from the 1930s detailed the disappearance of three local individuals over a single winter. Each had reported encountering strange figures in the woods before vanishing. The articles mentioned a search party finding an unusually deteriorated structure deep in the forest, but no trace of the missing people. More disturbing were my uncle's journal entries from just before his disappearance. He described meeting three solitary individuals who kept to themselves in the forest, their features indistinct, their movements unnaturally synchronized. They had proposed building a meeting place. His final entry mentioned returning to the structure after finding it mysteriously decayed overnight. The pattern stretched back further. Similar disappearances roughly every 30 years, always preceded by reports of three strange figures. I realized with growing horror that I was caught in a cycle that had claimed countless others before me. They returned last night. I heard them moving around the cabin, calling out in voices that now mimicked my uncle's, my mother's, even my own. They promised answers, companionship, an end to loneliness. Their offers were tempting. So tempting that I found myself reaching for the door handle before catching myself. I understand now what they are. Not ghosts in the traditional sense, but something older, emptier, hollow things that need to be filled. They've worn many faces through the centuries, discarding each when it no longer serves. They're patient and they're persistent. They don't need to break down my door because their true assault is on my mind, my will. I'm leaving tomorrow, heading back to the world of noise and people and meaningless conversation. A world that suddenly seems far less threatening than the silence of these woods. I don't know if distance will be enough to break their influence. Perhaps they can only exist here, bound to this place by rules I don't understand. Or perhaps they'll follow, wearing the faces of those three strange figures that now populate my nightmares. What I know with devastating certainty is that they're still out there waiting, and that the feeling of being watched will never completely leave me. The forest doesn't breathe at night because something else is using all its air. Something ancient and empty, endlessly patient, wearing faces that don't belong to it, building shelters that were never meant to protect. Story 4. The copper smell of blood filled my nostrils as I completed the final line on the wooden floor of my apartment. 3 years since Afghanistan, and the nightmares still hadn't stopped. 3 years of therapists telling me it would get better, that the memories would fade. They lied. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, I was taking matters into my own hands. The dim glow of my apartment's single lamp cast long shadows across the living room walls. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, the staccato rhythm matching my heartbeat. I'd heard about the ritual from Torres, another vet, who swore it had helped him find peace. Something about confronting the darkness he'd muttered during our last VA group session, making a deal with whatever's waiting on the other side. I hadn't believed him then now. Desperate for any solution I was willing to try. The Charlie game was supposedly meant for teenagers with pencils and paper, asking stupid questions to a Mexican ghost, but Torres had modified it. Blood instead of pencils, a proper summoning circle instead of crossed writing implements. He'd been vague about what exactly came through, but he'd stopped attending our sessions shortly after. The counselor said he was doing better, had moved away to start fresh. I needed that fresh start too. I sat back on my heels and examined my work. The circle wasn't perfect, but it would do. My palm stung where I'd sliced it open with my combat knife, the same one I'd carried through 2 tours. The blood had flowed easily, more than I'd expected, enough to complete the intricate pattern Torres had drawn for me on a cocktail napkin. 4 quadrants within the circle, each with its own set of symbols that I didn't understand. At the center, 2 lines of blood intersected to form a crude cross. Charlie. Charlie, are you there? My voice sounded hollow in the empty apartment. Nothing happened. The rain continued to beat against the windows, and somewhere in the building, a door slammed. I cleared my throat and repeated the words, this time louder. Charlie, Charlie, are you there? The air seemed to thicken around me. The hair on my arm stood on end as the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. I told myself it was just the storm outside affecting the building's heating system. Nothing supernatural, nothing to fear. But then the blood moved. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating. The intersecting lines at the center of the circle shifted as if drawn by an invisible finger, the cross rotating slightly clockwise. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, transfixed. This wasn't part of Torres's instructions. He'd said I might feel something, a presence perhaps, but he hadn't mentioned this. What are you? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The blood at the center of the circle bubbled slightly, then settled. No further movement, no response, just the sudden, overwhelming sense that I was no longer alone in my apartment. I scrambled to my feet, nearly slipping in my haste. Torres hadn't told me how to end the ritual, how to close whatever door I might have opened. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, planning to call him to demand answers, but the screen remained black dead, though I'd charged it just hours earlier. That first night, nothing else happened. I cleaned up the blood as best I could, though it left faint stains on the wooden floorboards that refused to come out no matter how hard I scrubbed. I convinced myself it had been a momentary delusion, a product of stress and too many sleepless nights. The rotating blood, a trick of the light, the sudden cold, a weather-related power fluctuation, the dead phone, a coincidence. I almost believed it until I woke the next morning to find a set of wet footprints tracking across my bedroom floor. They led from the foot of my bed to the closed bedroom door. 4-toed prints too large to be human, too distinctly formed to be a spill or shadow. They glistened in the morning light filtering through my blinds as if freshly made, though they were dry to the touch when I finally gathered the courage to examine them. They disappeared at the threshold of my bedroom door as if whatever had made them had simply vanished. My heart hammered against my ribs as I searched every inch of my apartment. Closets, cabinets under the bed, behind the shower curtain, all empty. The front door remained locked from the inside, the chain still in place. The windows were sealed shut. Had been since I moved in. Nothing could have entered. Nothing should have been able to leave those footprints. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps I'd sleepwalked, knocked over something that had spilled. Perhaps the pattern only resembled footprints. My mind connecting random shapes into something recognizable. I spent an hour cleaning the floor, erasing all evidence of the prints then left from my shift at the security firm, where I'd been working since my discharge. The day passed without incident. I didn't mention the ritual or the footprints to anyone. Who would believe me? They'd think I was having another episode like the one that had cost me my previous job. So I kept my mouth shut, did my rounds, and tried to convince myself that returning to my apartment that evening would reveal nothing out of the ordinary. I was wrong. The scratches started that night. 3 parallel lines gouged into the wooden frame of my bedroom door, deep enough that splinters protruded from the edges. They hadn't been there when I'd left that morning. I was certain of it. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the rough texture, the unmistakable evidence that something with claws had been in my home. My first instinct was to call the police. But what would I tell them that I'd performed some blood ritual and now a ghost or demon was scratching up my apartment? They'd have me committed. Instead, I did the next best thing. I set up my phone to record the living room while I slept. If something was moving around my apartment at night, I'd catch it on video. The footage the next morning showed nothing. Just my empty living room, undisturbed for the entire night. But the new scratches on the inside of my bathroom door told a different story. Same pattern, 3 parallel lines, as if something had tried to claw its way through. And worse, when I stepped out of the shower, I found matching scratches on my back, reflected in the steamed-up mirror. 3 lines red and inflamed, running from my right shoulder blade to the middle of my back. My hands shook as I applied antiseptic to the wounds. They weren't deep, barely breaking the skin, but their presence was undeniable. Something had touched me while I slept. Something had marked me. The thought made my stomach lurch, and I barely made it to the toilet before emptying the contents of my stomach. I called in sick to work, then spent the day researching. Everything I could find about the Charlie game, about summoning rituals, about how to reverse them. Most of what I found was teenage nonsense stories of slumber party scares and urban legends. Nothing about blood variations or what to do when something actually answered your call. By evening, my apartment felt like a prison. Every creak of the building, every shadow in the corners seemed malevolent. I couldn't stay there another night, so I threw some clothes into a duffel bag and checked into a motel on the edge of town. The place was run down, the kind that rented by the hour, but it wasn't my apartment. It didn't have wooden floors stained with ritual blood. It didn't have scratched doors or mysterious footprints. It felt safe, or at least safer. I was wrong about that too. The motel room's bathroom mirror revealed my reflection and something else. A shadowy figure standing just behind my left shoulder. My heart nearly stopped as I whirled around, finding nothing but empty air. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. Sleep was impossible. I sat with my back against the headboard lights on knife in hand until dawn broke. Every slight noise had me tensing, ready to defend myself against an attacker I couldn't see. The rational part of my brain insisted I was having a breakdown, that PTSD and isolation had finally pushed me over the edge into paranoia and hallucination. The rest of me, the part that had survived firefights and ambushes by trusting my instincts, knew better. Something was hunting me. I returned to my apartment the next day, drawn back by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The scratches had multiplied, appearing on every wooden surface, doorframes, floorboards, the legs of my coffee table. And now there was a smell subtle but unmistakable beneath the scent of the wood and my own fear sweat. The copper tang of blood, like the ritual, had never ended, like it was still ongoing somewhere, just out of sight. My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. Torres. I hadn't been able to reach him for days, had left increasingly desperate messages. His voice sounded distant, hollow, as if he was speaking from the bottom of a well. According to Torres, what I'd done wasn't a game at all. The ritual he'd shown me wasn't meant to call Charlie or any human spirit. It was older, designed to open a door for something that existed in the spaces between reality, something that had been waiting for an invitation, and I had invited it, sealed the pact with my own blood. When I asked how to send it back, the line went silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Torres spoke again, his voice now barely above a whisper. He explained there was a way, another ritual more complex than the first. It wouldn't banish the entity completely. Once summoned, such things never truly leave, but it would bind it, restrict its ability to interact with our world. I performed the binding ritual that night, following Torres' instructions precisely. More blood, more symbols arranged in a pattern that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. This time when I spoke the words he taught me, the response was immediate. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that my breath fogged in the air. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened. Coalesced moved against the walls in patterns that defied physics. And then I saw it, or at least part of it, a limb extending from the darkest corner of the room. Not quite an arm, not quite a tentacle, tipped with four elongated digits that ended in curved talons. It reached toward me, and I felt a pressure on my chest as if enormous weight was pressing down, forcing the air from my lungs. Blackness crept in at the edges of my vision as I struggled to breathe to move to complete the ritual. With the last of my strength, I spoke the final words Torres had given me. The pressure vanished instantly. The shadow limb withdrew. The temperature returned to normal. For a moment, I thought it was over. That the entity had been banished? Then I felt it. A presence inside my mind. A consciousness brushing against my own. Not gone. Bound to me. That was 3 weeks ago. The scratches have stopped. The footprints no longer appear in the night. To an outside observer, my apartment would seem normal, untouched by supernatural forces. But I know better. I feel it waiting, watching through my eyes, experiencing the world through my senses. During the day, I can almost forget it's there almost. But at night, when I close my eyes, I see what it wants me to see. Vast landscapes of twisted architecture. Worlds where physics operate by different rules. Where light behaves like liquid, and darkness has weight and substance. And sometimes in those dreams, I catch glimpses of others like me. Humans who performed rituals they didn't understand who now serve as vessels, as windows between worlds. Torres was right about one thing. The nightmares about Afghanistan have stopped. They've been replaced by something far worse. The knowledge that I'm never alone will never be alone again. That I've become a door that cannot be closed. I've started to notice changes in myself. Small things at first. Food tastes different. Colors seem brighter, or sometimes shift in my peripheral vision. My reflection doesn't always move in perfect synchronization with me, as if there's a slight delay, or as if something else is adjusting to the mechanics of my body. The binding holds for now. The entity cannot fully manifest in this world, cannot act independently of me. But I feel it learning, adapting, finding the edges of its confinement, testing, waiting. If you're reading this, if you've heard about some ritual that promises peace or power, or answers walk away, some doors aren't meant to be opened, some games aren't meant to be played, and some things once invited never truly leave. I know that now. I live with that truth every waking moment. And in the dreams that no longer feel like my own, I wasn't just summoning something from another world. I was offering it a home in me. Story 5. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the turbulence. It was the cold. A piercing, unnatural cold that seemed to emanate not from outside the aircraft, but from somewhere inside. Perhaps from inside me. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath fogged in front of my face, despite the cabin's environmental controls. Nobody else seemed to notice. The businessman beside me continued typing on his laptop. The flight attendant 3 rows ahead still poured coffee with a practiced smile. But I knew something had shifted in the fabric of reality around me even before I saw her standing in the aisle. I never knew my auntie in life. She died in 1970, 15 years before I was born, in what the family only ever referred to as the incident. There were no photographs of her displayed in any family home. Her name was seldom mentioned at gatherings, becoming one of those familiar ghosts that haunts not through presence but through conspicuous absence. All I knew came from snippets of overheard conversations. She had been a flight attendant. They called them stewardesses back then for Pan American. And she had been buried barefoot because of some superstition my grandmother held about shoes in the afterlife. Yet I recognized her immediately when she appeared at the front of the cabin during the worst turbulence I'd ever experienced. The Boeing 737 had been cruising smoothly at 30,000 FT somewhere over Nevada when the first jolt hit. My stomach lurched as the plane dropped what felt like 100 FT in seconds. The fastened seatbelt signs pinged on and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, assuring us that we were merely experiencing some unexpected rough air and that there was nothing to be concerned about. I'd flown enough to know that pilots always downplayed turbulence, but the tremor in his voice suggested something different this time. The second drop was worse. The overhead bins popped open, spilling bags and coats into the aisle. A chorus of gasps and muffled screams filled the cabin. The plane shuddered like a living thing in pain. My knuckles turned white against the armrests as sweat beaded on my forehead, despite the unnatural cold. That's when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. In the momentary darkness, something changed. When the emergency lights stuttered on with their sickly yellow glow, the aisle that had been empty moments before was now occupied. She stood facing away from me, her dark blue uniform crisp and perfect. Her hair pulled back in an immaculate bun according to regulations that hadn't been enforced for decades. Even from behind, something about her posture was wrong. Too rigid, too still amidst the violently shaking aircraft. No one else seemed to notice her. The businessmen kept typing. The flight attendants remained strapped in their jump seats, and the panicking passengers focused on their oxygen masks dropping from the ceiling. I blinked hard, convinced she was a hallucination born of fear and altitude. When I opened my eyes, she had turned to face me. Her features were familiar in that strange way family resemblances work. I recognized my own eyes staring back at me, though hers were glazed and vacant. Her lips, blue with cold, moved as though speaking, but no sound reached me over the roar of the struggling engines and the screams of fellow passengers. The most disturbing detail, however, was her bare feet against the airplane carpet. They were pale, almost blue, and somehow looked both solid and insubstantial at once. They left wet impressions on the floor. Not water, but something darker that disappeared seconds after she lifted each foot. My heart hammered against my ribs as adrenaline flooded my system. My mouth went dry and I found myself unable to swallow. Logic screamed that this couldn't be happening, that the woman standing impossibly still in an airplane being thrashed by atmospheric forces couldn't be my long-deaded aunt. Yet some deeper, more primal part of my brain recognized the truth immediately. Whatever was looking at me through those familiar eyes wasn't entirely human anymore. She began moving toward me. Each step was wrong, too fluid and too jerky simultaneously, as though her movements were being edited together from different frames of film. My breath came in short, painful gasps. The cold intensified until it felt like my lungs were filling with ice crystals. I wanted to scream to alert the other passengers, but my voice had abandoned me. The businessman beside me continued typing, oblivious. When she reached our row, he didn't look up, didn't react at all as she leaned over him to stare directly into my face. This close, I could see that her skin had the waxy quality of a department store mannequin, and fine cracks spread from the corners of her eyes and mouth, like a porcelain doll left too long in the sun. She mouthed words I couldn't hear, but somehow the meaning penetrated my consciousness anyway. Not your time. Not yet. The plane lurched again more violently than before, and I was thrown against the window. Pain exploded in my temple. For a moment, blackness engulfed me, not unconsciousness, but something deeper and more absolute, as though I'd been plunged into a void where light had never existed. When awareness returned, we were still in the air, but the turbulence had subsided to a gentle rocking. The cabin lights were back to normal, and the captain was announcing that we had navigated around the worst of the storm. Relief flooded the cabin. People laughed nervously, gathering their scattered belongings, dabbing at spilled drinks. Everything appeared normal except for the lingering cold that clung to me like a second skin, and the wet footprints leading from the front of the cabin to my row, slowly evaporating in the recycled air. I spent the remainder of the flight in a state of rigid terror, eyes darting to every movement, ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The rational part of my mind insisted I'd experienced a stress-induced hallucination, perhaps even a minor concussion from hitting my head against the window. The wet footprints could be explained by spilled drinks during the turbulence. The cold was just the aircraft's temperature control system, compensating after the electrical fluctuation. But I knew better. When we landed in San Francisco 3 hours later, I was the last to deplane, scanning every corner of the cabin for any sign of her. The flight attendants exchanged concerned glances as I lingered, clearly noticing my pallor and the tremor in my hands. One of them asked if I was feeling all right, suggesting that sometimes turbulence could trigger anxiety attacks in even experienced travelers. I mumbled something affirmative and hurried into the terminal, desperate for the solid ground beneath my feet and the reassuring press of crowds. That should have been the end of it. A strange experience at high altitude, an anecdote to share after a few drinks, a story that would either be received with nervous laughter or concerned looks. But as I collected my luggage and headed for the exit, a familiar cold spot bloomed between my shoulder blades. I froze, suitcase half lifted from the carousel as goosebumps erupted across my skin. Slowly, I turned around. The baggage claim area was packed with arriving passengers, but through gaps in the crowd, I caught glimpses of her standing perfectly still amid the flowing human traffic, that dark blue uniform, those bare feet. Each time someone walked between us, she seemed to be closer, though I never actually saw her move. My heart raced so hard I feared cardiac arrest. Sweat soaked through my shirt, despite the chill that now permeated my entire body. I abandoned my suitcase and ran like shoving past tourists and business people, ignoring their protests. I didn't stop until I burst through the terminal doors into the humid San Francisco night. A taxi took me to my hotel, where I locked the door, closed the curtains, and sat with every light blazing until dawn. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I needed sleep, that everything would make sense in the morning. Around 5:00 a.m., exhaustion finally overcame fear, and I drifted into an uneasy slumber. The dream came immediately. I was back on the plane, but it was empty except for me and Aunt Tilia, who sat across the aisle. In the dream, she could speak, though her voice sounded like wind whistling through cracks in a sealed room. She told me about the crash that had taken her life. Details my family had never shared. How the plane had encountered turbulence much like what we'd experienced. How the pilot had made a fatal error. How she knew they were going to crash minutes before it happened. How she'd removed her shoes because she'd heard that shoes were often the only things that survived plane crashes intact. And in some irrational part of her mind, she thought that if her shoes survived while she died, her soul might somehow be trapped in them. I wanted to wake up to escape the increasingly distorted version of my aunt, sitting across from me, her features subtly shifting and melting like wax under heat. But I remained trapped in the dream as she explained her purpose. She had been watching over our family for decades, she claimed, intervening when death approached prematurely. The turbulence on my flight hadn't been random. It had been a mechanical failure that should have resulted in catastrophic decompression. She had prevented it, but such intervention came with a price. A life extended must eventually be collected, she told me, her face now barely recognizable as human. Not your time yet, but soon. I'll come for you when it's time. I woke with a strangled scream, drenched in sweat, yet shivering with cold. The hotel room appeared normal in the morning. Light filtering through the curtains. No sign of supernatural visitation. No bare footprints on the carpet. I took a long hot shower, trying to wash away both the physical and psychological residue of my experience. By checkout time, I had almost convinced myself that stress and exhaustion had created the entire episode. 2 weeks passed. I returned home to Chicago, resumed my work routine, and the memory of Aunt Thelia began to fade like an old photograph left in sunlight. Sometimes at night, I would wake with an inexplicable chill, but I attributed it to Chicago's notorious drafty apartment buildings. Then came the call that changed everything. My mother, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't identify, asked if I would come to Thanksgiving dinner this year. Before I could answer, she added something that made my blood crystallize in my veins. She had been going through my grandmother's effects and had found Thalia's old uniform, perfectly preserved in a garment bag, since 1970. She thought I might like to have it given my interest in family history. There was something strange, though. The uniform was complete except for the shoes. My grandmother had apparently been adamant that Thelia be buried barefoot, insisting it was an old country tradition. My mother kept talking, unaware of my growing horror, mentioning offhand that it was odd I'd brought up Auntie at all. According to her, I'd called 3 weeks ago, the night of my flight, and left a rambling message asking questions about my aunt's plane crash. I had made no such call. As my mother continued speaking, I became aware of a familiar sensation spreading across my apartment. That unnatural cold that had first manifested on the airplane. My gaze was drawn to the hallway outside my bedroom, where the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been in the mid-afternoon light. I didn't need to look to know what I would see if I did. I could already feel her presence patient, inexorable waiting. Not my time yet, she had said. But soon. I realized then what I should have understood from the beginning. Anthelia hadn't saved me from death on that turbulent flight. She had merely delayed it, marked me, connected us in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. And somewhere in my apartment, wet footprints were appearing on the floor, one after another, coming steadily closer. Story 6. The whispers began. The moment we brought them into our home. Not audible whispers, nothing so obvious or merciful, but rather a persistent sensation of being observed, of a presence that demanded acknowledgement. The 3 pre-Ison vessels, each no larger than a coffee mug, but infinitely more significant, sat innocuously on the custom-built glass shelf in our living room. Their earthen surfaces adorned with faded geometric patterns in rust and black betrayed nothing of their true nature. But I knew better now. I knew they were waiting, watching, hungering. I never wanted to bring them to Canada. 6 months ago, my career as an investment banker had reached its pinnacle with a substantial promotion that necessitated our relocation from New York to Toronto. My wife, Elena, an art history professor specializing in pre-Columbian artifacts, had been thrilled not about moving to Toronto specifically, but because the journey would take us through Peru for 2 weeks. A necessary detour, she called it, to acquire items for her research. I should have questioned her enthusiasm more thoroughly. Elena had always been passionate about her work, but there was something different about her fixation on these particular artifacts. She had discovered them through an academic contact in Lima. 3 ceremonial vessels from a previously undocumented burial site near Cusco. The authentication paperwork seemed legitimate enough, though I later learned how easily such documents could be fabricated. The transaction occurred in a dimly lit back room of an antiquity shop that smelled of incense and damp earth, with a proprietor who seemed too eager to part with the vessels despite their apparent historical value. When I questioned the surprisingly reasonable price, Elena dismissed my concerns. She explained that the vessels were from a minor regional culture of interest, primarily to specialized academics like herself, rather than major museums. I accepted this explanation despite the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach, as the shopkeeper wrapped each vessel in cloth that looked suspiciously like funeral shrouds. Our guide, a local man named Miguel, had grown increasingly agitated as we finalized the purchase. While Elena was occupied with payment details, he pulled me aside and spoke in rushed, accented English. He advised against taking the vessels, saying they came from a ceremonial site and were known locally as vasos de sangre, blood cups. When I pressed for more information, he became evasive, mumbling something about the vessels requiring periodic feeding and being best left in their native soil. I dismissed his warnings as superstitious nonsense, designed to extract additional money from tourists, a common enough scam. That night in our hotel, I noticed Elena handling the vessels with unusual reverence, running her fingers along the rim of each one in a motion that seemed almost ritualistic. When I mentioned Miguel's warning, she laughed it off, though the sound lacked genuine amusement. She assured me that indigenous artifacts often accumulated such legends over time, particularly those associated with sacrificial practices. It was simply part of their cultural history, nothing to concern ourselves with. The flight to Toronto was uneventful, though I noticed a peculiar dampness on the cloth surrounding one of the vessels when we unpacked. Elena suggested it was condensation from the pressurized cabin, and I accepted this explanation despite knowing the cargo hold wasn't humid enough for such an effect. Our new home, a spacious Victorian in Rosedale, welcomed the vessels with an almost palpable shift in atmosphere. Elena arranged them prominently in our living room, angled so they caught the morning light through the bay windows. She spent hours photographing them for her upcoming paper, often losing track of time until I found her at 3:00 a.m., still adjusting lighting and angles with bloodshot eyes. The first incident occurred 3 weeks after our arrival. I woke to find a thin trail of rust-cold water leading from our bedroom to the living room. Following it, I discovered one of the vessels had somehow been moved from its shelf to the floor. The red substance inside, which I initially took for dirty water, had partially spilled onto the hardwood. Elena appeared unusually calm about the situation, theorizing that vibrations from a passing truck had dislodged it. She cleaned up the mess herself, refusing my help, and disposing of the rags immediately. I didn't mention that the substance had smelled metallic like copper like blood. My position at the Toronto office demanded considerable attention, so I initially failed to notice the subtle changes in our household. The power fluctuations that occurred precisely at sunset, the persistent cold spot near the display shelf that defied our top-of-the-line heating system, the dreams that began to infiltrate my sleep. Dreams of arid mountains of dark chambers carved into bedrock of figures in elaborate headdresses, chanting around 3 empty depressions in a stone altar. Elena changed too. She spent increasingly long periods staring at the vessels, often motionless for hours. Her academic work, once her primary passion, fell to secondary importance. When her department chair called concerned about her extended absence, I realized she hadn't attended faculty meetings for weeks. She began wearing exclusively red clothing, first subtly in accessories, then more overtly in sweaters and dresses. When I commented on this fashion choice, she seemed genuinely surprised, as though unaware of the transformation. The household accidents began approximately 2 months after our arrival. First, I sliced my palm while chopping vegetables, a deep cut that bled profusely onto the cutting board. Elena, rather than rushing for the first aid kit, calmly collected the blood-soaked board and disappeared momentarily before returning with bandages. I later found the board thoroughly cleaned, but not in its usual place in the kitchen. Next came Elena's nosebleed, sudden and violent, occurring precisely as she stood before the vessel display. Rather than stepping away to address it, she remained in place, allowing the blood to drip freely for several seconds, before responding to my alarmed exclamation. I could have sworn I heard a faint sizzling sound as drops struck the shelf beneath the artifacts. My own accident in the home office left a paper cut that seemed impossibly deep for such a minor injury. The blood soaked through several important documents, rendering them unusable. When Elena discovered this, she collected the papers with that same unsettling calmness, assuring me she would dispose of them appropriately. I never saw those papers again. Our careers began to suffer. My investment recommendations resulted in substantial losses for key clients. Elena received notification that her research grant application had been rejected due to methodological concerns regarding her acquisition practices. Our savings dwindled as unexpected expenses mounted. A basement flood, a roof leak directly above the vessel display. Though peculiarly, the vessels remained untouched by water damage. Automobile repairs following an inexplicable engine failure. Sleep became increasingly elusive. The dreams intensified now, featuring Elena in elaborate pre-ink and regalia, presiding over ceremonies I couldn't or wouldn't fully recall upon waking. More disturbing were the moments I'd wake to find her side of the bed empty, only to discover her standing motionless before the vessels, whispering in a language I couldn't identify. When confronted the next morning, she had no recollection of these nocturnal activities. During one such episode, I noticed fresh bandages on her index finger. When questioned, she claimed to have cut herself fixing a frame in her study. The frame in question, when I checked later, contained a meticulously rendered drawing of the 3 vessels surrounded by symbols that matched those in my dreams. The glass had indeed been recently replaced. It was spotlessly clean except for a small rust-cold fingerprint in one corner. Our social connections withered. Friends stopped calling after Elena behaved erratically at a dinner party, spending the entire evening discussing blood rituals in pre-Columbian cultures while repeatedly checking her watch as sunset approached. My colleagues maintained strictly professional interactions after I experienced a panic attack during a board meeting. Suddenly convinced that everyone present was wearing elaborate animal masks beneath their human faces. 4 months into our Canadian residence, I contacted Dr. Alejandro Vega, a Peruvian anthropologist who specialized in the region where our vessels originated. Our video consultation began professionally enough with me showing him photographs of the artifacts. His expression remained neutral until I rotated the largest vessel to display its base, at which point his scholarly composure fractured. He explained reluctantly at first that the markings identified these as ritual objects from a small, isolated culture that practiced particularly aggressive forms of sacrifice. Unlike their contemporaries who performed such rituals seasonally, this group believed their deities required continuous offerings. The vessels, which he called kolka diwanui, or reservoirs of death, were designed to collect and preserve sacrificial blood, maintaining a continuous connection between the mortal and divine realms. When I pressed him about our experiences, his academic detachment faltered further. He asked whether we had noticed an escalation of accidents, particularly those resulting in bloodshed. His expression at my affirmative response conveyed nothing so simple as fear, rather a resigned recognition. He explained that the vessels removed from their ceremonial context and ancestral lands would seek to replicate their original purpose. They required periodic feeding blood offerings and an eventual return to their place of origin. The longer they remained abroad, the more aggressively they would pursue fulfillment of these requirements. I scoffed at these assertions despite the cold dread settling in my chest. When I asked why anyone would create such objects, his response haunted me. They were never meant to leave their temple complex. They had been designed specifically to prevent theft through supernatural deterrence, the ultimate security system, for a culture that valued blood as the supreme currency between worlds. Before ending our conversation, Dr. Vega issued a clear warning. Return the vessels to Peru immediately, specifically to a temple foundation near their excavation site, accompanied by an offering. The nature of this offering remained deliberately vague in his explanation, though the implication was clear enough. When I asked about alternatives, his response was simple and chilling. We had already begun paying in blood. The vessels would merely increase their collection efforts until satisfied. I ended the call convinced the man was either perpetuating superstitious nonsense or attempting to acquire valuable artifacts through intimidation. Yet that night, I dreamed more vividly than ever of standing before a stone altar knife. In hand, Ilna beside me wearing elaborate ceremonial attire, the three vessels positioned to catch what would flow from my outstretched arm. I woke to find myself standing in the living room, a kitchen knife in my grip position directly before the vessel display. Elena stood opposite me, her expression vacantly serene, a similar knife in her own hand. The vessels between us seemed to pulse with a dull, earthen glow. Neither of us spoke as awareness gradually returned. The knives clattered to the floor simultaneously. That morning, without discussion, I booked 2 tickets to Lima. Elena, emerging from whatever fugue had claimed her these past months, helped me carefully rewrap the vessels in their original cloths. As we worked, I noticed fresh scars on her forearms, thin, precise lines that couldn't have resulted from household accidents. She caught my gaze and wordlessly pushed up my own sleeve, revealing similar marks I had no memory of acquiring. In the following days, as we prepared for departure, the household atmosphere shifted palpably. The cold spots dissipated. The power remained stable. Sleep, when it came, was dreamless and deep. Yet occasionally I would catch Elena staring longingly at the wrapped packages, her fingers tracing absent patterns on her arms. Once I found her in the kitchen, a knife balanced across her palm. Her expression disturbingly contemplative until I spoke her name. The return journey to Peru feels like an extension of our shared trance. We move through airports and taxis with mechanical efficiency, the wrapped vessel secured in a specialized carrier. Elena has arranged for a local guide, not Miguel, whose number no longer connects to meet us at a specific location outside Cusco. She assures me the guide understands our purpose without elaboration. Tomorrow, we will make the final journey to return these artifacts to their original location. Elena has packed additional supplies she refuses to detail. I've seen the bandages and collection vials in her kit, but choose not to question them. Part of me knows has perhaps always known what the vessel's final feeding will require. I tell myself we're simply returning stolen artifacts to their rightful place, participating in cultural repatriation, rather than anything more primitive or supernatural. Yet, as I write this in our Lima hotel room, watching Elena sleep peacefully for the first time in months, I cannot deny the pulse I feel emanating from the wrapped packages across the room. They seem to beat in rhythm with my heart, a synchronization that feels both invasive and strangely intimate. The vessels know they're going home. They know we understand our role as both couriers and final tribute bearers. I should feel relief that our ordeal approaches its conclusion. Instead, I'm disturbed by the hollow sensation expanding within me. Not fear exactly, but a resignation that borders on anticipation. Part of me has begun to understand the ancient impulse that created these vessels, the belief that some connections can only be forged through blood. More disturbing still is the realization taking shape as I watch the vessel's subtle pulsation. I'm not entirely certain we'll actually return them. Elena stirs in her sleep, her fingers tracing geometric patterns against the sheets. The same patterns etched into the vessel's surfaces. The same patterns now faintly visible beneath the skin of my forearms when I stand in certain light. Perhaps we'll board our return flight to Canada empty-handed, telling ourselves we've done the right thing. Perhaps the vessels will remain in their rightful place among the ruins, or perhaps they've already found their new home. Story 7. The corner of our living room doesn't belong to this world. I've known it since the day my wife and I moved into her family home. A colonial monstrosity with too many rooms and too few windows. Something about the way shadows collect there, defying the natural flow of light. My brother and sister visit often, claiming the familiarity of their childhood home draws them back. But I've seen how they both stare at that corner, heads tilted in unison, responding to questions no one has asked. They call him Grandfather in Portuguese, a language neither of them speaks. Their grandfather has been missing for 30 years. Not dead, the family insists, just missing. I first noticed it 3 weeks ago when the autumn chill crept into Massachusetts. My sister Emma sat cross-legged before that damned corner, nodding and smiling at empty space. Joel, my brother, stood nearby, hands in pockets, contributing occasional words to this one-sided exchange. When I asked who they were talking to, Emma simply pointed to the corner and said, "Vovo is telling us about Portugal?" John smiled apologetically, explaining that they'd always been able to see him there, even as adults. The casual way they dismissed my confusion sent ice through my veins. That night, I watched my wife Maria sleep her breathing, even despite the occasional twitch of her eyelids. The moonlight cast bars across our bed, and I wondered what images played behind her closed eyes. She'd mentioned dreaming of corridors lately, endless hallways lined with stone. A voice calling her forward. The next morning, her face appeared gaunt, exhausted. She described walking through an infinite mausoleum-like corridor, where she'd encountered her father, the same grandfather my siblings conversed with in our living room corner. According to Maria, he had messages for us all. The house began changing after that. Nothing drastic at first, a light that refused to stay on. The persistent smell of tobacco, though no one smoked. Doors that swung open after being firmly closed. I attempted to capture the corner on camera, setting up equipment when everyone had gone to bed. The footage showed nothing but static and electronic distortion whenever I pointed the lens at that specific area. When I suggested to Maria that we have the electrical wiring checked, she looked at me with unfamiliar eyes and suggested I was being unnecessarily anxious. My research into the family history revealed precious little. Maria's grandfather, Antonio Santos, had immigrated from Portugal in the 1950s, built this house with his own hands, and then vanished 3 decades ago during a routine trip to Boston. No body was ever found, no trace of foul play. The family steadfastly refused to declare him dead. His room remained untouched on the 3rd floor, preserved like a museum exhibit. The first time I entered that room, my lungs constricted as though the air had suddenly thickened. Photographs covered every surface. Antonio as a young man in Portugal at his wedding, holding his children, building this very house. My attention fixed on one particular image. Antonio standing in our living room precisely in front of that corner, his expression unreadable. Behind him, barely visible in the faded photograph, stood a dark figure, its features indistinct but unmistakably present. I began experiencing episodes of missing time. I'd be working in my home office, then suddenly find myself standing before that corner, with no recollection of how I'd gotten there. My skin would be cold to the touch, my heart hammering against my ribs as though I'd been running. Sometimes I'd find notes in my own handwriting scrolled in Portuguese, a language I'd never studied. The dream started a week later. I found myself walking through stone corridors that extended endlessly in all directions. The walls were lined with small alluves, each containing photographs and personal items I recognized from Antonio's room. The air hung heavy with the scent of tobacco and sea salt. A voice echoed throughout this labyrinth, speaking in Portuguese the words incomprehensible, yet somehow familiar. I would wake gasping for air, my pajamas soaked with sweat, the taste of salt on my lips. I began avoiding the living room altogether, making excuses to work late or run errands when my siblings visited. Maria noticed my avoidance, confronting me with accusations of distancing myself from her family. I couldn't explain that every time I entered that room, I felt watched by something ancient and patient. How could I describe the pressure that built behind my eyes whenever I approached that corner? Or the whispers I'd begun to hear when alone in the house? Yesterday I broke. Joel and Emma had been sitting in the living room for hours, engaged in their one-sided conversation with empty space. I stormed in, demanding to know what game they were playing. The look of genuine confusion on their faces sent chills racing down my spine. Emma asked if I was feeling well, stating that Volvo had been concerned about my health lately. Joel mentioned that Volvo had been telling them about a hidden space beneath the house, one that connected to a network of tunnels. Tunnels that supposedly led to the same corridors Maria had been dreaming about. My hands trembled as I examined the foundation plans I'd retrieved from the town records office. The original blueprints showed nothing unusual, but a revision filed 3 years after construction indicated an addition, a small cellar beneath the northeast corner of the house, the living room corner. The clerk couldn't explain why this revision had been filed separately from the main plans, or why it had been marked with a strange symbol rather than the official town seal. That night, after Maria had fallen asleep, I took a crowbar to the floorboards in that corner. The wood came away with surprising ease, as though it had been recently disturbed. Beneath, instead of the expected floor joists and insulation, I found a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from this opening carried the unmistakable scent of tobacco and sea salt, the same smell from my dreams. My flashlight revealed stairs carved directly into the earth, spiraling down farther than its beam could reach. The walls were lined with the same alluves from my dreams, each containing photographs, letters, and small personal effects. I recognized Maria's childhood toys, John's high school soccer medals, Emma's first pair of glasses. My fingers brushed against one alcove and came away wet, not with groundwater, but with salt water that stung the paper cuts on my hands. As I descended the staircase, gradually transformed the earthen walls giving way to worked stone, the roughly carved steps becoming smooth marble. The temperature dropped steadily until I could see my breath clouding before me. The flashlight beam weakened, though I'd put in fresh batteries before starting my exploration. The darkness seemed to consume the light rather than be illuminated by it. At what felt like hundreds of feet below the house, the staircase opened into a corridor identical to the one from my dreams. The hallway extended in both directions, curving gently so that I couldn't see more than 100 ft in either direction. The walls were lined with more alluves, these containing items I'd never seen before. Faded photographs of people who resembled Maria but weren't her. Letters in Portuguese bearing dates from centuries past. Small carved figurines that seemed to shift position when viewed from the corner of my eye. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat echoing in the confined space. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold, running down my face and neck in icy rivulets. My mouth went desert dry as I forced myself forward, choosing a direction at random. The flashlight flickered, plunging me into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. In those brief seconds of blackness, I heard footsteps behind me, unhurried and deliberate. I spun around the beam of light slicing through empty corridor, but the footsteps continued, now ahead of me, now behind. Now from side passages I hadn't noticed before. My own breathing sounded thunderous in this underground space, coming in short, panicked gasps that did little to satisfy my oxygen-starved lungs. My muscles tensed, preparing for flight, though I had no idea which direction offered escape. The corridor began to shift subtly as I moved forward. The ceiling lowered incrementally, forcing me to stoop. The walls seemed to press inward, narrowing my path. The alloves grew more frequent and more personal, containing items from my own life, my college diploma, the tie I wore at my wedding, the manuscript of my unfinished novel, which I kept locked in my desk drawer. A photograph of myself as a child, standing in front of a house I'd never seen with people I didn't recognize. A voice called out from somewhere ahead, speaking Portuguese in the same cadence as the whispers I'd been hearing in the house. The words remained incomprehensible, but their meaning seemed to press against my mind, seeking entrance. My ears popped as though I'd descended much deeper than physically possible. The taste of salt grew stronger in my mouth. Around a bend in the corridor, a figure stood with its back to me. The shape was unmistakably human. Dressed in clothes from another era, a heavy wool coat, high-waisted trousers, a flat cap clutched in one hand. Even without seeing the face, I knew this was Antonio. His shoulders rose and fell with breath, dispelling any notion that I was seeing a ghost or hallucination. My legs locked in place as terror flooded my system. Antonio began to turn, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who has all the time in the world. I caught a glimpse of his profile, the same strong nose and jawline that Maria had inherited, before my survival instinct finally kicked in. I turned and ran, no longer caring about the direction, simply needing to be away from that figure who couldn't possibly exist in this underground labyrinth. The corridor twisted and branched, offering choices I made blindly, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across stone walls. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I continued running until I collided with a dead end. The stone wall before me was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, overlapping, showing the house from various eras. In each image, no matter the decade, the same dark figure stood in the corner of the living room. Sometimes in the foreground, sometimes barely visible in the background, but always present, always watching. Among these was a photograph I recognized, my wedding day. Maria and I stood before the house surrounded by her family, and there in the window, visible but overlooked until now, was the distinctive silhouette of an elderly man watching the proceedings. The flashlight died completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. The air became thick, almost solid in my lungs. Footsteps approached from behind, unhurried and confident. A hand cold and dry as parchment came to rest on my shoulder. A voice spoke directly into my ear in accented English. "You are part of this family now. You are part of this house. The corridors connect us all." I didn't remember climbing back up the staircase or replacing the floorboards. I awoke this morning in bed beside Maria, my clothes filthy with a mixture of earth and what laboratory tests would later confirm as sea salt from the Atlantic coast of Portugal. Under my fingernails were stone fragments that geologists would identify as not belonging to any formation in North America. Maria smiles at me differently now. She says I finally understand her family. My siblings visit more often, all three of them sitting before that corner, acknowledging the presence. I can now see the silhouette of an elderly man that becomes more solid each day. They tell me that Volvo is pleased that I found the corridors, that I'm truly part of the family now. I've begun dreaming of the corridors myself. Each night they become more familiar, less frightening. Sometimes I wake to find myself standing in that corner, engaged in conversation with Antonio in broken Portuguese that improves with each passing night. He tells me about the house, about the corridors that connect it to Portugal, to the past, to other places entirely. Maria doesn't know that I've discovered her grandfather's journal hidden in a compartment beneath his bed. The entries date back to the 1950s, detailing his discovery of the corridors beneath the original foundation, how he learned to navigate them, how he found they could take him anywhere across oceans across time. The final entry, dated the day of his disappearance, describes his plan to remain in the corridors permanently to become their guardian and keeper. I have started taking Portuguese lessons. I tell Maria it's to better connect with her heritage. The truth is both simpler and more terrifying. I need to understand what Antonio is telling me about my role in all this, about what the house expects from me, about why he chose our family to guard the corner that doesn't belong to this world. The corner watches me now, waits for me, and sometimes when the house is quiet and the shadows gather just right, I find myself walking toward it, drawn by the promise of corridors that lead everywhere and nowhere at once. Story 8. And the first time I noticed the porcelain ballerina had moved, I dismissed it as forgetfulness. The second time I blamed the uneven floorboards of my grandmother's Victorian home in Alton. By the third time, when I found it staring at me from the foot of my bed at 3:00 a.m., its delicate painted face catching moonlight through the curtains, I could no longer deny something was terribly wrong in this house. My inheritance of grandmother Eleanor's estate came with strings attached specifically that I would live in her home for at least 1 year before deciding its fate. The insurance money from my apartment fire left me with few options, so I accepted the terms and moved into the creaking, drafty mansion on State Street that had intimidated me throughout my childhood. I'd always found excuses to avoid overnight visits. Something about the house setting my nerves on edge even as a teenager. Now at 36, I was trapped here by circumstance and legal obligation. The porcelain ballerina had been grandmother's prized possession, a handcrafted antique she'd received on her 16th birthday. She'd shown it to me dozens of times during my visits, always handling it with white cotton gloves, explaining how rare and valuable it was. I'd never understood her attachment to the thing. Its frozen puette and blank blue eyes had always seemed unsettling rather than beautiful. When I unpacked it after moving in, I placed it in the glass cabinet in the parlor, hoping to keep it safe but out of sight. The night winds howled through the eaves as I carried the ballerina back to the cabinet for the fourth time that week. My fingers trembled as I placed it on the shelf, careful not to damage its delicate tutu or outstretched arms. Despite the central heating system I'd installed, my breath clouded in front of me. The nearby thermometer read 42 degrees, though the rest of the house maintained a comfortable 72. This cold spot had appeared the day after I moved in, centered perfectly around the cabinet that housed grandmother's collection. I closed the cabinet door, hearing the latch click into place. My pulse hammered in my throat as I tested the door locked as it should be. I was the only person with a key to that cabinet. The rational part of my brain insisted there must be a logical explanation for the ballerina's movements. But that voice was growing fainter with each passing day. My friend Marcus had suggested setting up cameras after hearing about my haunted ballerina, as he mockingly called it. He dropped off a set of motion-activated security cameras the previous weekend, barely concealing his amusement at what he clearly considered to be my overactive imagination. According to Marcus, old houses settled and played tricks on the mind. He suggested I was sleepwalking or perhaps experiencing some delayed trauma response to my apartment fire. I wished I could believe him. The cameras had captured nothing unusual for 3 nights. The porcelain ballerina stayed in place. The house remained quiet, and I began to think perhaps I was indeed losing my grip on reality. Then on the 4th night, every camera in the house failed simultaneously at 2:17 a.m. When they came back online at Vol.3 a.m., the ballerina was perched on the kitchen counter facing my bedroom door. The footage showed no evidence of tampering or entry. No shadows, no movement, no explanation. Just 106 minutes of darkness and a relocated porcelain figurine. My hands shook as I poured myself a double whiskey, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim of the glass. The rational explanations were dwindling. Yet I couldn't bring myself to accept the alternative, that something supernatural was happening in my grandmother's house. The pressure in my chest tightened, my heart racing, as cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I drained the glass hoping the alcohol would calm my frayed nerves or at least help me sleep. As October deepened into November, my sleep deteriorated further. I jolt awake at odd hours, certain I'd heard footsteps on the stairs, or a woman humming an unfamiliar melody. Shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to shift and elongate when viewed from my peripheral vision. The cold spot around the cabinet expanded, engulfing the entire parlor, then spreading to adjacent rooms. I began researching the history of the house, spending hours at the Alton Public Library, poring over property records and newspaper archives. The house had been built in 1873 by a river merchant named Hobson, who'd made his fortune in the steamboat era. After his financial ruin in the 1890s, the house changed hands several times before my grandmother purchased it in 1962. Nothing in its documented history suggested tragedy or circumstances that might explain a haunting. The librarian, a gray-haired woman with wire-rimmed glasses, watched me with growing concern as I returned day after day, my appearance becoming increasingly disheveled, dark circles forming under my eyes. After a week of this, she approached my table with a slip of paper. She murmured that if I was experiencing disturbances in an Alton home, I might want to speak with Dr. Mercer at the Historical Society. The way she emphasized disturbances made my skin crawl. She wouldn't meet my eyes as she turned and walked away. Dr. Mercer was a small, energetic man with a meticulously trimmed white beard. When I mentioned my grandmother's address, his enthusiastic expression faltered momentarily. He confirmed what the property records had shown. The house had an unremarkable history. No murders, no unexplained disappearances, nothing that would generate the kind of energy that paranormal enthusiasts associated with hauntings. But something in his hesitation made me press further. After some reluctance, Dr. Mercer admitted that while the house itself had no dark history, the land it stood on had been part of a property that once belonged to the Zimmerman family in the early 1800s. My pulse quickened at the name, blood rushing in my ears. The Zimmermans had been prominent citizens, he explained, until a scandal involving the eldest daughter led to their departure from Alton society. The family had moved west, leaving no descendants in the area. When I asked the daughter's name, Dr. Mercer consulted his notes and confirmed what I already feared. Candace Candy Zimmerman. My hands grew numb as pins and needles spread through my fingers. The room seemed to tilt slightly, Dr. Mercer's voice becoming distant and muffled. I hadn't told him about the Ouija board. I hadn't told anyone. It had been a foolish decision born of desperation after 6 weeks of escalating phenomena. I'd purchased the board from a New Age shop in downtown Alton, the proprietor, warning me with practiced solemnity about opening doors that couldn't be easily closed. I'd nodded impatiently, dismissing her concerns as superstitious nonsense meant to add mystique to an overpriced piece of cardboard. That night, I'd set up the board on the dining room table, positioning my cameras to record the session. The house had seemed unusually quiet as I placed my fingers on the planchette, the heating system falling silent despite the thermostat being set to 78 degrees. My breath fogged in front of me as I asked if anyone was present. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. I felt simultaneously relieved and disappointed until the planet began to move with such sudden violence that my fingers could barely maintain contact. It spelled out a name, Psi-I-M. When I had asked who Candy was, the planet had dragged my fingers to Betrayed and then Witness before flying off the board entirely and clattering against the far wall. The cameras recorded the entire incident, including the planchette's impossible trajectory that defied physics. I deleted the footage the next morning in a moment of panic, suddenly afraid of what might happen if others saw it. Leaving the Historical Society, my mind raced with questions. What did a long-dead woman from the 1800s have to do with my grandmother's porcelain ballerina? What betrayal had occurred? And what had Candy witnessed? The answers began materializing that night. I woke to the sound of breaking glass at 2:17 a.m., the same time the cameras had failed weeks earlier. My body felt lean, paralyzed with a terror that went beyond normal fear. The temperature in my bedroom had plummeted, my breath forming dense clouds above my face. Through the open doorway, I could see the hallway where moonlight illuminated the porcelain ballerina positioned outside my room. Beside it lay the shattered remains of a small hand mirror I recognized from my grandmother's vanity. In the fragments, I caught glimpses of reflection that didn't match the room around me. Flashes of a different time. Women in long dresses. A garden that no longer existed behind the house. My muscles finally responded to my brain's commands and I stumbled from the bed, heart hammering painfully against my ribs. I approached the ballerina cautiously, noticing a detail I'd somehow missed before. Painted onto the porcelain face was a tiny beauty mark near the right corner of the mouth, nearly invisible unless viewed in direct light. The realization hit me with such force that I staggered backward, colliding with the wall behind me. I'd seen that same distinctive beauty mark in one of the old photographs in Dr. Mercer's office on the face of Candace Zimmerman. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in my car in the driveway, too terrified to remain in the house but too exhausted to drive anywhere. When dawn broke, I forced myself to return inside, drawn to the cabinet where grandmother had kept her collection. With trembling hands, I retrieved the key from my pocket and unlocked it. The ballerina had returned to its shelf, though I hadn't moved it. More troubling, I now noticed the base of the figurine, which I'd always assumed was a solid piece of porcelain. Closer inspection revealed a barely perceptible seam. Using my pocket K knife, I carefully pried at the edge until the base separated from the figurine. Hidden inside was a folded scrap of yellowed paper. The handwriting faded but still legible. A confession signed by my grandmother detailing how she'd discovered evidence of Candy Zimmerman's murder while renovating the house in the 1960s. A crime committed by one of Alton's most respected historical figures. Rather than report it, she'd hidden the evidence to protect the town's reputation and her social standing. The beauty mark on the ballerina had been her private acknowledgement of her silence, her secret penance. The note ended with words that sent ice through my veins. She follows me now. She watches. The witness has become my witness. Understanding flooded through me. The ballerina wasn't haunted. It was a vessel. A connection to a woman whose story had been erased, whose justice had been denied. My grandmother's guilt had given Candy power. And now that connection had transferred to me. I knew what needed to be done. That afternoon, I contacted Dr. Mercer and local authorities, turning over the confession and explaining what I'd found. The scandal rocked Alton, forcing a re-examination of its celebrated history. Excavation began in the area that had once been the Zimmerman Garden, now covered by my driveway. I expected the phenomena to cease after the truth was revealed, but in this I was mistaken. The ballerina still moves, though, less frequently and with less malevolence. Sometimes I find it facing photographs of my grandmother. Other times looking out windows toward the garden where Candy's remains were finally recovered and properly buried. I've chosen to remain in the house beyond my obligated year. There's a strange comfort in our arrangement now. Me, the house, and the porcelain witness who ensures I never forget the cost of silence. On quiet nights, I sometimes hear a woman humming from the parlor, the melody no longer unfamiliar. The chill never quite leaves certain rooms, and sometimes the mirrors show reflections that don't belong to this century. But we've reached an understanding, Candy and I. Truth was all she wanted. Someone to acknowledge what had happened to her. To speak her name again in the town that had chosen to forget her. I keep the ballerina on my nightstand now, its blue eyes watching as I drift to sleep. Some might find this arrangement terrifying. Perhaps it is. But there are worse fates than sharing your home with a ghost who only wanted to be remembered. Far worse is the knowledge that my grandmother went to her grave carrying the weight of her silence, haunted by the witness she refused to become. Story 9. The first time my sister mentioned seeing her, I dismissed it as nothing more than the imagination of a woman exhausted from caring for our dying grandmother. The second time I suggested she get more sleep. By the third time, she'd already moved out of the house, refusing to spend another night under that roof. 6 months later, I inherited the property. 6 months and 1 day later, I saw the girl with blue bows myself. The Victorian house had stood on Blackwood Lane for over a century, weathering storms, both meteorological and familial. Its aging wooden bones creaked with each gust of wind, as if sighing under the weight of accumulated memories. When I moved in after my grandmother's passing, I told myself it was practical free housing, while I sorted out my life after a bitter divorce. The truth, which I barely admitted even to myself, was that I needed to understand what had driven my sister away. Rebecca had always been the rational one between us. As children, she was the one who checked the closets and under the beds when I was convinced monsters lurked in the darkness. She became a research scientist devoted to empirical evidence and logical conclusions. So when she called me at 3:00 in the morning, her voice trembling as she described seeing a young girl with blue hair bows sitting in our grandmother's favorite chair, I knew something was wrong. She just sat there. Michael. She had whispered, her voice barely audible over the static of the phone line. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting watching me. Then she smiled. The second sighting occurred a week later. Rebecca had fallen asleep on the couch while reading research papers. She woke suddenly, the sensation of being watched pulling her from sleep. The girl was lying on the opposite end of the sofa, her small feet nearly touching Rebecca's legs, those blue bows vivid against her pale hair. Rebecca moved out the next day, staying with me until she found her own place 50 minutes away. I unpacked my belongings slowly during that first week in the house, each box a commitment to staying. Despite my sister's warnings, the master bedroom remained untouched. I couldn't bring myself to claim what had been my grandmother's space. Instead, I took the room that had once been Rebecca's, its walls still bearing the faded outlines of posters she had hung as a teenager. The house felt larger than I remembered, the hallway stretching longer in the evening shadows. I attributed the goosebumps on my arms to poor insulation, the whispers at the edge of hearing to pipes and settling foundations. The scientific explanations became my mantra as I moved through the empty rooms. I established a routine quickly, hoping structure would combat the unease that crept along my spine whenever I entered certain areas of the house. My grandmother's sitting room remained closed, her favorite chair draped with a sheet like a surrendered ghost. I told myself it was out of respect, not fear. The first incident occurred 11 days after I moved in. I'd been in the kitchen preparing dinner, the radio playing softly to combat the silence. The music cut out abruptly, replaced by static that grew progressively louder. My skin prickled as the temperature in the room plummeted my breath, forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Then came the laughter, high and childlike, yet somehow wrong, as if played at the wrong speed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly turned toward the doorway. Nothing, just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. I convinced myself it was a power surge affecting the radio, ignoring how the laughter had seemed to come from all around me, rather than the speakers. 3 days later, I was working at my laptop in the living room when the scent of lilacs filled the air. My grandmother had always worn lilac perfume, its sweet fragrance announcing her presence before she entered a room. I inhaled deeply, memories washing over me. When I opened my eyes, they fell on a small indentation in the sofa cushion beside me, as if someone weightless had just vacated the spot. The fabric was slightly warmer than the surrounding material when I placed my hand on it. My throat constricted, my mouth suddenly bone dry. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as I stared at that subtle depression in the fabric. The rational explanations I had clung to began to slip through my fingers like sand. I called Rebecca that night, my voice steadier than I felt as I casually asked about her experiences in the house. She hesitated before speaking, her words carefully measured. She described how the phenomena had started, small objects relocating when her back was turned. The sensation of someone watching her from doorways. The lilac scent appearing in empty rooms. She asked if I'd seen the girl yet. When I said no, her relief was palpable through the phone. "Don't look for her," she warned. "Pretend everything is normal." I followed her advice for nearly a week, deliberately averting my gaze from movements at the corner of my vision, ignoring the soft footsteps that sometimes followed me up the stairs. The pressure in the house seemed to increase with each passing day, as if the air itself was becoming denser, harder to move through. Sleep became elusive, my nights punctuated by the sound of something small, dragging across the wooden floor above my room. I would lie rigid beneath my blankets, my heart threatening to burst from my chest, as I strained to track the movement by sound alone. It always stopped directly overhead, followed by silence so complete it had its own weight. On the seventh night, exhaustion overcame caution. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow steps to the attic, determined to find a raccoon or squirrel, anything to explain the sounds that had denied me rest. The beam of light cut through dusty air as I swept it across stacked boxes and forgotten furniture. Nothing moved in the confined space. As I turned to leave, the light caught something reflective near the dormer window. A small music box I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened as I approached it. The box was ornate, its surface adorned with painted flowers and inlaid mother of pearl. With trembling fingers, I lifted the lid. A tiny melody emerged, the notes distorted by age. Inside lay a blue ribbon carefully folded into a bow. The temperature dropped so rapidly that I gasped, the flashlight slipping from my suddenly numb fingers. It hit the wooden planks with a thud, rolling to stop with its beam, pointing toward the attic entrance. In that narrow corridor of light, I saw them. 2 small feet in antiquated button-up shoes, the hem of a white dress just visible above them. Every muscle in my body seized as primal terror surged through my system. I couldn't raise my eyes, couldn't look higher. My lungs refused to function, spots dancing at the edges of my vision as oxygen deprivation set in. The feet took 1 step forward. I broke, then scrambling backward on all fours, my elbow striking the music box and sending it clattering across the floor. The melody distorted further, speeding up and slowing down in sickening fluctuations. When my back hit the wall beneath the window, I finally forced my gaze upward. Nothing stood in the beam of light. The doorway was empty. My retreat from the attic was undignified, a blind stumbling punctuated by choked whimpers. I slept in my car that night, keys in the ignition, ready to flee. Morning brought shame and renewed determination to find logical explanations. I researched the history of the house, discovering that the original owners had indeed lost a daughter to illness in 1892. Her name was Elizabeth. I convinced myself that knowledge was power. If there was a presence in the house, understanding its origin might help me address it. This rationalization allowed me to return inside, though I avoided the attic and kept lights on in every room I occupied. 3 days passed without incident. I began to relax, attributing my experience to exhaustion and suggestion. Then came the morning I entered the kitchen to find all the cabinet doors standing open, as if someone had searched for something in a hurry. My hands shook so badly that coffee sloshed over the rim of my mug as I prepared it. The sensation of being watched intensified to an almost physical pressure between my shoulder blades. I refused to turn around, focusing instead on the mundane task before me. When I finally did turn, I caught a glimpse of something white disappearing around the doorframe. That night, I called my friend Daniel, inviting him to stay for a few days without explaining why. His presence brought normality to the house, the strange phenomena receding like shadows before sunlight. We spent evenings watching sports and reminiscing about college, the banality of S.H.I.E.L.D. against what lurked in the corners of my awareness. On his 3rd night, I woke to his shouts. I found him in the hallway, his face ashen in the emergency light that illuminated the corridor during the apparent power outage. His words came in disjointed bursts as he described waking to find a young girl sitting at the foot of his bed, her pale hair adorned with blue bows. She had asked him to help her find her mother. When he reached for his phone to use as a light, she vanished. We spent the remainder of the night in my car again, neither of us willing to return inside until daylight reclaimed the shadows. Daniel left after breakfast, his expression haunted as he promised to call me later. The message he sent instead contained a link to a realtor's website. List it was all he wrote. Alone again, I felt the house's atmosphere change as if it sensed my determination to leave. The incidents escalated, doors slamming with such force that hinges bent, the music box melody playing from empty rooms, the constant lilac scent now tinged with something putrid underneath. I lasted 2 more days before contacting Rebecca, my voice cracking as I asked if I could stay with her while I arranged to sell the house. She agreed immediately, making me promise to leave before nightfall. As I packed a bag, the temperature in my bedroom plummeted. The closet door, which I had deliberately left open since the attic incident, slowly swung closed. My heart nearly stopped as a small hand with delicate fingers curled around the edge of the door before it shut completely. Abandoning my belongings, I bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time in my desperation to reach the front door. In the foyer, I froze. My grandmother's sitting room door stood open, the sheet removed from her favorite chair. Sitting there, her small feet barely touching the floor, was a girl of perhaps 7 or 8. Her blonde hair was pulled back with blue bows that matched her eyes. Those eyes, far older than her appearance suggested, met mine without blinking. My mind registered absurd details in that moment of terror. The outdated style of her white dress, the slight translucence of her form, the way she seemed to disrupt the air around her like a heat mirage. She smiled, revealing teeth too numerous and sharp to belong to a human child. "Grandmother said you'd stay," she said, her voice both childlike and ancient simultaneously. "But you're leaving like the other one." I backed toward the door, unable to look away from her unnatural gaze. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper through my constricted throat. Her smile widened impossibly. "Company!" My hand found the doorknob, cold metal grounding me in reality. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure why I was apologizing. "I can't stay." "Everyone leaves," she said, her form flickering like a candle in a draft. "But someone always comes back. I'll wait." I fled, then the door slamming behind me with a finality that vibrated through my bones. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A small figure stood in the upstairs window, blue bows vivid against the gathering darkness. Rebecca wasn't surprised when I arrived at her apartment, my hand still shaking too badly to hold the coffee she offered. After I recounted my experience, she revealed what additional research had uncovered about the house's history. Elizabeth, the original owner's daughter, had not died alone. Her caretaker, a young woman named Margaret, had perished the same night, discovered seated in a chair by Elizabeth's bed. The official cause was listed as an unknown illness. Diary entries found later suggested Margaret had been slowly poisoned by the child in her care. Elizabeth's mother had apparently been confined to an asylum shortly after their deaths, where she raved about her daughter's unnatural appetites and the darkness that lived behind her eyes. We sold the house 3 months later, disclosing nothing of our experiences to the young couple excited about their first home purchase. Sometimes I dream of blue bows and lilac perfume, waking with the certainty that small feet have been patting around my bed while I slept. Last week, Rebecca called. "The house has gone back on the market." The couple left suddenly, breaking their mortgage contract and abandoning most of their belongings. According to local gossip, their friend had been staying in the guest room when she reported seeing a small girl with blue bows sitting in a chair watching her sleep. Rebecca and I have agreed never to drive down Blackwood Lane again. Some doors once opened can never be truly closed, and some entities are patient enough to wait decades for new company to arrive. Story 10. The moment I set foot on the weathered steps of the observation tower at Uncle Wilbur's ranch, the air changed. It became dense, resistant, as if the atmosphere itself objected to my presence. A chill slithered down my spine, despite the oppressive August heat that had hounded me all day. The tower stood separate from the main house, a sentinel of splintered wood and rusted metal that had somehow withstood decades of prairie winds. I had no reason to climb it that evening, no logical explanation for why my feet carried me there as the sun bled across the horizon. Some urges defy rationality, and some warnings go unheeded until it's too late. I was 17 that summer, spending my last vacation before college with my eccentric uncle at his isolated Texas ranch. The property sprawled across acres of grassland, punctuated only by the occasional twisted mesquite tree. Uncle Wilbur had inherited the land from his wife's family, a family I knew little about beyond hushed conversations that ceased whenever I entered a room. My parents never explained why we rarely visited, only that Uncle Wilbur preferred his solitude since Aunt Martha passed. That was 15 years ago. The tower had been Aunt Martha's project. Uncle Wilbur had said offhandedly on my first day. He never elaborated, and something in his voice warned against pressing for details. The wooden steps groaned beneath my weight as I ascended. Each creak seemed to whisper a warning, growing more urgent as I climbed higher. My hand gripped the splintered railing, feeling the rough wood dig into my palm. By the time I reached the small enclosed platform at the top, my heart had already begun to hammer against my ribs. Not from exertion, but from a nameless dread that had no business existing on such an ordinary evening. The observation room was octagonal, with windows on all sides offering panoramic views of the ranch and the dirt road that stretched toward the distant highway. The glass was clouded with decades of dust and grime, giving the sunset an otherworldly quality as its light filtered through. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the scent of mildew and something else. Something sickly sweet that reminded me of the funeral home where we'd said goodbye to my grandmother last winter. I wiped a small circle clean on the western window, intending to watch the sunset. That's when I first noticed them. They sat motionless in the tall grass about 50 yards from the tower facing the road. A family of four arranged as if on an invisible couch, a man, a woman, and two figures that might have been teenagers. They were unnaturally still, their forms slightly translucent in the dying light edges, blurred like an overexposed photograph. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked hard, convinced my eyes were playing tricks in the strange light. But when I looked again, they remained unmoved. Their clothes seemed old-fashioned, the man in what looked like a suit with a high collar, the woman in a long dress with her hair piled atop her head. The smaller figures were less distinct, but their postures suggested a posed formality that felt wrong artificial. I stepped back from the window, my heel catching on a loose floorboard. The sound echoed in the small space like a gunshot. But the figures didn't react, didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the noise in any way. My skin prickled with gooseflesh despite the stuffy heat of the enclosed space. Sweat beaded on my forehead and upper lip cold despite the temperature. My mouth had gone dry, tongue sticking to the roof as I tried to swallow. Logic offered explanations. Mannequins placed as a prank. Reflections in the dirty glass. A family of visitors Uncle Wilbur hadn't mentioned, but logic crumbled as I circled the tower checking each window, only to find them visible from every angle, still motionless, still staring at the empty road. I forced myself to look away to examine the room instead. The space was largely empty except for an ancient wooden chair in the center and a small table against one wall. On the table lay a leather-bound book, its cover cracked and faded. With trembling fingers I opened it, finding yellowed pages filled with cramped handwriting. The ink had faded in places, but I could make out dates. Entries spanning from 1897 to 1919. Each entry was brief, clinical, almost noting times, weather conditions, and observations of the road. The final entry, dated October 17th, 1919, simply read, "They're waiting still. She comes tonight. May God have mercy." My pulse throbbed in my ears as I closed the book. The room seemed to contract around me, the air growing thinner. I returned to the window, compelled by a force I couldn't name. The family remained, but the quality of the air around them had changed. It seemed to shimmer like heat rising from sun-baked asphalt. As darkness crept across the land, they became more defined rather than less glowing, with a faint phosphorescence that made my stomach churn. I needed to leave to return to the safety of the main house. My muscles tensed, ready to flee, but my attention caught on something new. Movement on the road. At first I thought it was a trick of the fading light, but then I saw her clearly, a woman in white, her dress billowing around her, as if suspended in water rather than air. She didn't walk so much as drift, her feet occasionally seeming to lift entirely from the ground. Her face was obscured by long, dark hair that hung like a curtain, but her posture conveyed purpose. She was approaching the waiting family. My mouth went cotton dry as my heart slammed against my ribcage. My fingers clutched the windowsill nails, digging into the soft, rotted wood. I wanted to run, to clatter down those creaking stairs, and never looked back, but my legs had turned to lead. All I could do was watch, transfixed, as the scene unfolded. The woman stopped about 10 ft from the seated family. For endless moments, they regarded each other in silence. Then slowly she raised her arms. The gesture wasn't threatening, but supplicating, imploring. The seated figures remained unmoved, their rigid postures suggesting refusal. The woman's shoulders slumped, and even from this distance I could sense her despair. What happened next defied explanation. The woman's form began to change, her white dress rippling violently as if caught in a gale, though not a breath of wind disturbed the prairie grass. Her hair whipped upward, revealing her face for a split second, a face so gaunt and hollow-eyed that my heart seemed to stutter in my chest. Then she was airborne, levitating several feet above the ground, her dress and hair flowing outward in all directions like a terrible white sun. A sound reached my ears, then not from outside but seemingly from within the tower itself. A low, keening wail that vibrated through the floorboards and resonated in my bones. It wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was grief made audible, desolation given voice. My hands flew to my ears, but the sound penetrated flesh and bone, reaching directly into my mind. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath fogged in front of my face, and ice seemed to form in my veins. The journal on the table began to flip its pages rapidly as if caught in a violent draft. The lone chair spun slowly, deliberately in the center of the room. And all the while that terrible wailing continued rising in pitch until it bordered on a scream. My body finally responded to my brain's desperate commands to flee. I stumbled toward the stairs, my coordination shot by terror, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. As I reached the doorway, a sudden silence fell so absolute that the absence of sound seemed to press against my eardrums. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I looked back. The ghost woman now hovered directly outside the tower window, her face level with mine, separated only by the dirty glass. Her features were more skull than flesh, her eyes deep hollows that somehow still held awareness and recognition. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. She pressed one withered hand against the glass, leaving no condensation, no physical trace. But where her fingers touched the decades of grime, cleared, creating 5 perfect streaks of transparency. Through these cleared lines, I could see the seated family more clearly. They had turned no longer facing the road, but looking directly at the tower at me. Their faces held the same emaciated quality as the floating woman's. Skin stretched tight over bone eyes sunken into dark recesses. But while her expression held desperation, theirs conveyed only cold judgment. Uncle Wilbur had never told me about Aunt Martha's family, never explained why we seldom visited. But in that moment, as 4 pairs of hollow eyes fixed on me from across the darkening field, I understood with sickening clarity that I was looking at relatives I would never meet in life. My paralysis broke. I plunged down the stairs, missing steps, banging elbows and knees against the railings, barely registering the pain. Halfway down, a hand clutched my ankle, icy cold, impossibly strong. I didn't look back, just kicked wildly and felt my foot connect with something that gave way with a sound like dried leaves crushed underfoot. The grip released and I practically fell the rest of the way down. The ground seemed to tilt beneath me as I sprinted toward the main house, my lungs burning, a metallic taste flooding my mouth. Behind me, the wailing resumed now, accompanied by other voices, a chorus of inhuman sounds that pursued me across the darkened yard. I burst through the back door, slamming it behind me and throwing the deadbolt. Uncle Wilbur sat at the kitchen table, a glass of amber liquid before him, his expression unsurprised. He didn't ask why I was shaking, why sweat plastered my hair to my forehead, or why my eyes were wild with terror. He simply nodded toward the chair opposite him, as if he'd been expecting me. He didn't need me to explain what I'd seen. Instead, he spoke of a family feud that had divided the property a century ago, of his wife's ancestors who had died waiting for reconciliation that never came, of Martha's great-aunt Eleanor who had tried to bridge the divide and was turned away again and again, until grief and rejection drove her to end her suffering at the foot of the tower, of bodies buried on opposite sides of the property line, separated in death as they had been in life. Uncle Wilbur believed the cycle could be broken, that someone of both bloodlines might witness their vigil and understand. That's why he had invited me this summer, because my mother had married into the family that owned the eastern half of the original property. because I carried both bloodlines in my veins. The next morning, I insisted we leave. I couldn't stay another night knowing what waited in the fields after sunset. Uncle Wilbur didn't argue, but as we packed the car, he pressed the tower key into my palm, closing my fingers around it. The metal felt unnaturally cold despite the summer heat. He told me I would return someday when I was ready, that the waiting family knew me now, that Eleanor would find me wherever I went. That was 3 years ago. I've moved 4 times since then, changing cities, changing states. But some nights I wake to the sound of a woman wailing outside my window. Some mornings I find 5 clean streaks on dusty glass. And always, I feel them waiting. My spectral relatives seated in judgment, their hollow eyes fixed on my future. The key to the tower sits in my bedside drawer. I know with a certainty that chills my blood that it would fit any lock when the time comes for me to return. Sometimes in my darkest moments, I wonder if I haven't been in the tower all along. If I ever actually left, if all that followed was just the desperate fantasy of a mind that couldn't accept what waited outside those grimy windows. Because no matter how far I run, the waiting family draws nearer. And Eleanor, with her billowing white dress and reaching hands, calls to the blood we share. Uncle Wilbur was right. I will return to the tower. The only question is whether I'll go willingly or be drawn back by forces that transcend my understanding. Either way, when sunset bleeds across the Texas prairie again, I'll take my place in this generation's old vigil. And perhaps at last I'll learn what they've been waiting for all this time. Story 11. The Victorian mansion loomed against the twilight sky, its weathered facade and pointed gables casting long shadows across the overgrown garden. I hadn't planned to stay here. This remote bed and breakfast miles from the nearest town, but the sudden storm in my car's sputtering engine had made the decision for me. As the elderly propri led me through the foyer, the floorboards groaned beneath our feet as if the house itself protested my arrival. But it wasn't the peeling wallpaper or musty smell that made my skin prickle with unease. It was the dolls, dozens of them. Porcelain faces with glass eyes that seemed to track my movements as I followed my host up the narrow staircase to my room. I am not a superstitious man. At 35, with a career in academic research and a lifetime of rational thinking behind me, I'd always dismissed tales of haunted houses and possessed objects as nothing more than folklore designed to explain the unexplainable. Yet something about this place, about those lifeless faces with their painted smiles, sent a chill down my spine that no amount of logical reasoning could dispel. The room assigned to me was small but clean, with faded floral wallpaper and a 4-poster bed that dominated the space. And there, arranged on a shelf opposite the bed, sat 5 antique dolls, their Victorian-era dresses, meticulously preserved, their blank expressions frozen in eternal smiles. When I asked the proprie, her face hardened. She informed me curtly that the dolls were part of the room's historical authenticity and couldn't be moved. Each had belonged to a young woman who had once lived in this house, she explained, and they remained as a tribute to those who had come before. I unpacked my overnight bag while trying to ignore the sensation of being watched. The doll's glass eyes reflected the dim light from the bedside lamp, creating tiny pinpricks of illumination in their otherwise lifeless faces. I positioned myself so my back was to them as I worked on my laptop, attempting to focus on the research paper I needed to complete by the end of the week. The rain intensified as night fell, lashing against the windows with growing ferocity. The old mansion's electricity flickered twice before stabilizing. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, and I decided to turn in early. Sleep, however, proved elusive. The unfamiliar bed creaked with every movement, and the wind howled through some unseen crack in the window frame, creating a high-pitched whistle that set my teeth on edge. Just as exhaustion began to pull me under, a sound different from the storm's fury penetrated my consciousness. A whisper so faint I nearly missed it beneath the rain's steady drumbeat. It would be my heart's desire. My eyes snapped open, pulse instantly accelerating. The room was dark save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the shelf where the doll sat still and silent as before. I strained my ears but heard nothing more than the storm convincing myself it had been a trick of my tired mind or the wind's mournful cry. I rolled over and eventually drifted into a fitful sleep. Morning brought weak sunlight and a false sense of security. I laughed at my midnight anxiety while showering in the shared bathroom down the hall. The reprieved a hearty breakfast in the dining room, informing me that I was the only guest that day. When I mentioned having trouble sleeping due to the storm, she nodded sympathetically, but said nothing about the dolls or the strange whisper I'd heard. I decided against bringing it up, not wanting to sound like a grown man frightened by children's toys. With my car still dead and the mechanic unable to come until the following day, I resigned myself to another night at the bed and breakfast. I spent most of the day in town, having walked the 3 miles rather than remain in that house with its watchful porcelain inhabitants. The local library provided a welcome distraction, and I researched the history of the area, discovering that the mansion had once belonged to a wealthy industrialist in the late 1800s. Several tragedies had befallen the family over the years, including mysterious illnesses and disappearances, though the accounts were vague and possibly exaggerated for dramatic effect. Returning to the bed and breakfast as dusk approached, I felt a growing reluctance with each step. The sensation intensified when I entered my room to find something had changed. The dolls appeared to be in the same positions, yet something felt different. I stared at them, trying to pinpoint what was bothering me, when I realized the middle doll, the one in the blue dress with blonde ringlets, was now facing slightly more in my direction than I remembered. My heartbeat quickened as I approached the shelf. I hadn't touched them, and the propri had mentioned that she never entered guest rooms during their stay. I examined the doll closely, noticing now that its porcelain hands folded demurely in its lap had tiny, perfect fingernails painted a faded pink. One hand seemed to be clutching something, a miniature locket that I hadn't noticed before. The rational part of my brain suggested that I simply hadn't observed these details previously. Yet a growing sense of disquiet persisted as I prepared for bed. My back deliberately turned toward the shelf as I changed into sleep clothes. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably despite the summer warmth outside, and I pulled the quilt up to my chin as I lay down, fighting the childish urge to hide completely beneath the covers. Sleep came reluctantly, disturbed by creaking floorboards and the distant chiming of a clock I hadn't noticed during the day. I drifted in and out of consciousness, jerking awake several times to stare into the darkness, convinced I'd heard movement. During one such moment, lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white light. And in that instant, I could have sworn the middle doll was no longer on the shelf. My throat-constricted pulse hammering against my ribs as I fumbled for the bedside lamp. The switch clicked, but no light came. Power outage. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill in the air. I reached for my phone hands, shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The screen's glow revealed the time, 3:14 a.m., and cast just enough light for me to see the shelf. The middle doll was missing. A sound escaped me, part gasp, part whimper, as I swept the phone's light around the room. The rational explanations flooded in. I was mistaken about the number of dolls. It had fallen behind the shelf. The proprie had removed it. Yet none of these thoughts could calm the primal fear now surging through my veins. Something scraped against the wooden floor. A sound like tiny feet dragging across the boards. It came from beneath the bed. My muscles froze, lungs barely drawing breath as I strained to listen. Silence stretched for several heartbeats, then another scrape followed by what sounded horribly like the rustle of stiff fabric. It would be my heart's desire. The whisper came from directly under me. The voice childlike yet ancient, innocent yet somehow hungry. My body reacted before my mind could process, leaping from the bed, stumbling across the room, fumbling with the doorknob that seemed to resist my desperate attempts to turn it. When the door finally gave way, I practically fell into the hallway, gasping for breath. The house was pitch black, the storm having knocked out all power. Using my phone's light, I made my way downstairs, intending to wake the proprietress to demand explanations, to insist on leaving despite the hour and weather. I found her in the kitchen calmly drinking tea by candlelight, as if she'd been expecting me. When I frantically described what had happened, words tumbling over each other in my haste to explain, she listened with an expression that shifted from concern to something that looked unsettlingly like satisfaction. She suggested I might have been dreaming that old houses played tricks on the mind, that perhaps I'd care for some tea to calm my nerves. I refused, insisting on checking the room together. She sighed, picking up her candle, and followed me upstairs, her movements unhurried, almost reluctant. When we entered the room, the shelf held 5 dolls exactly as before. The middle one sat primly in her place blue dress, arranged perfectly blonde ringlets framing her porcelain face. The propri gave me a pointed look, suggesting my imagination had gotten the better of me. But as she turned to leave, the candlelight flickered across the doll's face, and I noticed something that sent ice through my veins. A smudge of dirt on her previously immaculate cheek, and clutched in her tiny hand, barely visible in the dim light, was a thread that matched the pattern of my pillowcase. I spent the remainder of the night in the sitting room downstairs, unable to face returning to that room, to those eyes that now seemed more alive than dead. The propri left me alone after providing a blanket, her expression unreadable as she disappeared back to her quarters. I didn't sleep, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house, my mind racing with questions that had no rational answers. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the mechanic arrived earlier than expected and declared my car easily fixed, just a loose connection in the battery, I nearly wept with relief. The propri, unsurprised by my hasty departure, accepting my payment with a knowing smile that made my skin crawl. As I threw my bag into the trunk, ready to put as much distance as possible between myself and that place, she approached, holding something wrapped in tissue paper. She pressed it into my hand despite my protests, insisting it was a customary parting gift for guests. Her fingers felt cold and brittle against mine, like porcelain rather than flesh. Only when I was miles away, the mansion no longer visible in my rearview mirror, did I unwrap the package. Inside was a tiny locket identical to the one the doll had been holding. With trembling fingers, I opened it, finding inside a lock of blonde hair tied with blue thread, and a scrap of paper with words written in faded ink. "It would be my heart's desire to keep you forever." I threw it out the window, pressing the accelerator to the floor, trying to outrun the memory of glass eyes that seemed too aware of whispers in the darkness of tiny footsteps across an ancient floor. But even now, months later in my apartment, hundreds of miles away, I sometimes wake in the night, heart-pounding, convinced I've heard a familiar voice whispering those words. And on those nights, I could swear I catch a glimpse of something small moving in the shadows. Something with blonde ringlets and a blue dress. Something whose desire seems far from fulfilled. Story 12. The words hung in the air like a noose. Black man better run. My sister had spelled it out to my mother 30 years ago, her small fingers forming each letter with unnatural precision. I remember staring at her vacant eyes, wondering where she had learned such a phrase. That night was the first time I heard the laughter dry and brittle like dead leaves scraping across pavement. The first time I felt those eyes watching me from the shadows of my bedroom. The first time I heard those words that have haunted me for decades. I found you. Sleep has become my enemy. 3 hours, maybe 4 on a good night. The rest is spent staring at the ceiling, listening for sounds that don't belong in my empty apartment. The medication bottle on my nightstand mocks me with its promises of rest. The pills don't work anymore. Nothing works when you're being hunted. My therapist believes it's trauma manifesting as paranoia. She doesn't know about the smell like soil and decay that follows me everywhere. She doesn't see the black mold that appears in the corners of rooms I've just cleaned, spreading in patterns that almost resemble letters. She hasn't felt the temperature drop suddenly breath-fogging in the middle of summer, or noticed how digital clocks sometimes freeze at 3:33 a.m. for hours. I moved to the city to escape the memories, but they followed me across state lines. The apartment is sterile and modern, all clean lines and minimalist furniture. Nothing like the old Victorian house where it all began. Yet somehow the shadows here are deeper. The silence more absolute. I've installed motion sensor lights in every room. They trigger randomly in the middle of the night. The incident with my sister was just the beginning. Our parents dismissed it as a strange coincidence, something she must have heard on TV or from other adults. They didn't connect it to the strange occurrences that followed the inexplicable cold spots, the whispers that seemed to come from inside the walls, the family photos where our faces appeared blurred, while an indistinct figure gradually became clearer in the background. By the time they began to worry, it was too late. The presence had attached itself to me. My phone buzzes with a text from Marcus asking if I'm still coming to his gallery opening tomorrow. I haven't left the apartment in 3 days. The thought of moving through crowds of people feeling exposed and vulnerable sends a cold sweat breaking across my skin. My hands tremble as I type a non-committal response. The screen distorts momentarily, pixels rearranging themselves into what looks like a woman's face before returning to normal. I drop the phone as if it's burned me. The bathroom mirror shows the toll of sleepless nights. Dark circles hang beneath bloodshot eyes. My skin has a sickly pallor, and I've lost enough weight that my collarbones jut sharply beneath my t-shirt. Running my hand over 3 days of stubble, I notice a single strand of white hair that wasn't there yesterday. I'm 35 but look 50. Water sputters from the faucet, initially running clear before darkening to a rusty brown. I've complained to the building manager twice this week. He insists there's nothing wrong with the plumbing. The water clears after running for 30 seconds, but the metallic taste remains when I brush my teeth. Outside my window, the city continues its normal rhythm. People hurry along sidewalks, cars honk in traffic. Construction crews drill and hammer in the distance. Normal life happening just beyond my reach. I press my palm against the glass, feeling the vibration of the world that I can no longer fully participate in. My breath fogs the window, and in the condensation, a finger that isn't mine traces the words, "Found you from the other side." My heart hammers against my ribs. I stumble backward, tripping over a coffee table and crashing to the floor. The impact knocks the wind from my lungs, and for several terrifying seconds I can't breathe. When I finally drag myself to my feet, the window is clear. No message, no evidence of what I saw. But the air in the apartment has changed. Heavier, charged with anticipation, the prescription bottle calls to me. Just one more pill, even though I took the maximum dose 2 hours ago. My hands shake so badly I spill half the contents across the counter. White tablets scatter like tiny bones. As I reach to gather them, I notice something dark moving beneath my skin. A shadow pulsing along my veins from wrist to elbow before disappearing. The sensation burns like ice water injected directly into my bloodstream. My research began as an attempt to understand what was happening to me. Old folklore, obscure religious texts, paranormal accounts. I devoured them all, looking for patterns, explanations, solutions. The connections I found were tenuous at first. Stories of parasitic entities that attach themselves to families, passed down through generations like a curse. Entities that feed on fear and isolation, growing stronger as their hosts grow weaker. In an ancient Mesopotamian text, I found a reference to the Whisper Woman, who comes when her name is called or spelled out, even unknowingly. In 17th century Salem journals, accounts of a black widow spirit that could only be seen clearly in reflections or through a child's eyes. In West African folklore, an entity that attaches itself to a victim who inadvertently summons it, gradually draining their life force until they become a hollow vessel for the spirit to inhabit. The stories varied in details but shared common elements that matched my experience. The inexplicable cold, the deterioration of physical health, the progressive isolation of the victim, the feeling of being constantly watched, and most importantly, the whispered phrase that preceded the entity's appearance. "I found you." Night falls earlier these days, or perhaps it just seems that way because darkness has become my prison. The last crimson rays of sunset bleed across my living room wall like an open wound. I should turn on more lights, but movement requires more energy than I can muster. I sit in my armchair, watching shadows lengthen and deepen, taking shapes that don't correspond to the objects casting them. The sound starts as a gentle scratching, like fingernails dragging lightly across drywall. It's coming from inside the wall behind me, moving slowly from left to right, then up toward the ceiling. I've learned not to react visibly. She feeds on my fear. Instead, I grip the armrests until my knuckles turn white, keeping my breathing steady despite the frantic thumping of my heart. The scratching stops directly above me. Plaster dust drifts down like snow, landing in my hair and eyelashes. My mouth tastes of copper and dirt. Then comes the smell, that distinctive odor of wet soil and decomposition that announces her presence. The air pressure changes, making my ears pop painfully. I swallow a whimper and force myself to remain still. Something drips onto my shoulder, thick and black, with the consistency of tar. It burns through my shirt, searing my skin beneath. More drops fall, creating a pattern across my chest and arms. My muscles lock in terror, preventing me from brushing away the caustic substance or fleeing from the chair that now feels like it's gripping me, rather than the other way around. The lights flicker once, twice, then die completely, plunging the apartment into absolute darkness. In the silence that follows, I hear my own ragged breathing, the blood rushing in my ears, and beneath that something else. A wet, rhythmic sound like meat being tenderized. The darkness seems to pulse with malevolent awareness. My phone lights up across the room, its screen casting a pale blue glow that illuminates only a small circle. Text messages appear one after another, all from unknown numbers, all containing the same phrase. "Black man, better run." My sister's voice echoes in my memory, spelling those words with childish innocence, unaware of what she was calling forth. The television turns on by itself, broadcasting only static. Within the visual noise, a shape begins to coalesce, the silhouette of a woman with impossibly long limbs and a head that tilts at an unnatural angle. The static crackles and hisses occasionally, forming words, "Found you, found you." I've tried everything to rid myself of her presence. Cleansing rituals from a dozen different spiritual traditions, protection amulets and symbols, consultations with priests, shamans, paranormal investigators. Nothing worked. Some refused to help, after meeting me sensing something dark attached to me that they dared not confront. The only strategy that's provided any relief is understanding her rules. She's bound by certain patterns. She can only physically manifest after being acknowledged. She grows stronger in isolation but weaker when I connect with others. She can influence technology but can't cross running water. Most importantly, she can't take me until I surrender to despair. My legs finally respond to my commands. I lunge for the door, stumbling through the darkness with arms outstretched. My shin connects painfully with the table edge. I crash into a bookshelf, sending volumes tumbling around me. The doorknob feels impossibly cold under my palm, and for one horrifying moment it seems to squirm like something alive. The hallway outside my apartment is empty but brightly lit. I slam the door behind me, gasping for breath that doesn't seem to fill my lungs. The rational part of my brain suggests this is a panic attack, but I know better. She's trying to suffocate me to make me rush back inside where she waits. Instead, I stagger toward the elevator, punching the call button repeatedly. The display above the doors shows the car descending from the 12th floor, stopping at each level on its way down. 7, 6, 5. The lights in the hallway begin to dim, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. Figure 3, 2. The temperature drops sharply. My exhaled breath forms clouds in front of my face. The elevator dings as it reaches the lobby, but the doors remain closed. Behind me, I hear my apartment door creaking open slowly. From inside, that familiar dry laughter echoes. My muscles tense, preparing to run for the emergency stairs when the elevator doors finally slide open. Inside stands an elderly woman with a concerned expression. She holds the door as I practically fall into the elevator, jabbing frantically at the lobby button. As the doors close, I catch a glimpse of something crawling along the hallway ceiling toward us. A twisted, elongated figure moving in jerky, insect-like movements. The woman beside me seems oblivious, checking her watch and humming softly. My reflection in the elevator's mirrored wall shows more than just my haggarded appearance. Over my shoulder, another face gradually comes into focus. Gray skin stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, eye sockets, empty and leaking black fluid lips pulled back in a rich grin, revealing needle-like teeth. She raises one skeletal finger to her lips in a shushing gesture. I fight the urge to scream. The elderly woman glances at me curiously. She asks if I'm feeling all right, commenting that I look like I've seen a ghost. The banality of her statement triggers a hysterical laugh that I barely manage to suppress. In the mirror, the entity mimics my expression, her mouth stretching impossibly wide. When the elevator reaches the lobby, I mumble an apology and rush past the confused woman. The building's glass doors lead to a street crowded with evening commuters. I merge into their flow, allowing myself to be carried along by the current of humanity. Surrounded by people, I feel the entity's grip loosening slightly. She hates crowds. They dilute her power and make it harder for her to reach me. I find myself at a busy cafe several blocks from my apartment. The warmth and noise provide a temporary sanctuary. I order coffee I don't want just to secure a seat. My hands shake so violently that I spill half the liquid when I try to drink it. The barista watches me with suspicion. I must look deranged, unshaven, wild-eyed, wearing a stained shirt and no jacket despite the autumn chill. My phone buzzes with a message from Marcus responding to my earlier text. He's worried about me. Says he's coming over after his shift ends. I type a warning, telling him not to go to my apartment, but the message fails to send. The signal icon shows full strength, but every attempt to call or text results in an error. Technology bends to her will when she's active. Night settles over the city. The cafe begins to empty as closing time approaches. I can't go back to the apartment, but I have nowhere else to go. Marcus might be heading there now, unaware of what waits in the darkness. I should warn him, but how my wallet contains enough cash for a cheap motel, at least for tonight. Tomorrow, I can figure out a more permanent solution. I've fled before started over in new cities. But she always finds me, eventually. The barista announces last call. Outside, the street lights create pools of illumination against the gathering darkness. I choose a path that keeps me in these pools of light, avoiding the shadowed areas between. 3 blocks to the motel I remember passing earlier. 3 blocks of exposed vulnerability. I'm halfway there when all the streetlights on the block go out simultaneously. Darkness swallows the street like a living thing. The few pedestrians still out exclaim in surprise, but continue on their way, illuminating their paths with phone flashlights. My own phone is dead. Its screen black and unresponsive. The air grows thick with that familiar earthy scent. My lungs strain against it, each breath becoming shallow and painful. Something moves in the darkness beside me, a shifting of shadows that suggest a form without revealing it completely. I walk faster, fighting the urge to run. Running excites her, triggers her predatory instinct. The motel's neon sign appears ahead, a beacon of mundane safety, just another 100 FET. My legs feel lean as if I'm wading through mud. The shadows around me pulse and writhe with increasing agitation. A sound like dry branches snapping follows my footsteps. I'm nearly there when I feel it. Cold, bony fingers brushing against the back of my neck. My body goes rigid with terror. From behind me comes that whispering voice. So close that faded breath warms my ear. I found you. I spin around, confronting empty air. But reflections tell the truth she can't hide. In the motel's glass door, I see her clearly for the first time in years. Her form towers over mine, emaciated limbs bent at impossible angles, skin like ancient parchment stretched over a misshapen frame. Her face is mostly hidden by lank, colorless hair, except for that terrible grin with too many teeth. The decision crystallizes in my mind with sudden clarity. 30 years of running, hiding, and gradually losing pieces of myself to fear. 30 years of watching her grow stronger as I grow weaker no more. I straighten my spine and face the empty air where I know she stands. Using my voice feels strange after so many days of silence. It comes out as a rasp at first, then strengthens with each word. I speak to her directly, acknowledging her presence but rejecting her power. I recite the true names I've discovered through years of research watching, as the shadow in the reflection recoils. I establish boundaries, claiming my autonomy against her parasitic intrusion. The air around me grows colder, then hot, then cold again. As she rages against my defiance, the lights of the motel flicker violently. In the glass reflection, her form distorts and twists, becoming more monstrous. The pressure in my ears builds until I fear my eardrums will rupture. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stops. The air clears, the pressure releases, the lights stabilize. In the reflection, I see only myself haggarded, exhausted, but alone. Something has changed, not a banishment. She's too powerful, too deeply connected to be cast out completely, but a renegotiation of terms. I check into the motel with the last of my cash. The room is basic, but clean. For the first time in months, I feel the possibility of rest. My phone buzzes back to life with a message from Marcus. He went to my apartment, found it empty, but felt uneasy there and left quickly. He's relieved when I tell him I'm safe. As I prepare for sleep, I catch movement in the bathroom mirror. Just a flicker, a suggestion of her presence. She's still with me, will always be with me in some form, but something fundamental has shifted in our relationship. I've stopped running and in doing so changed the rules of our game. I turn off the lights and lie in the darkness that once terrified me. She's there in the corner, a deeper shadow among shadows. I acknowledge her with a nod before closing my eyes. "I know you found me," I whisper, "but you don't own me." For the first time in years, I sleep without dreaming. Story 13. The memories we bury always find a way to surface like bodies in shallow graves after heavy rain. That summer in 1997, I saw something in Blackwood Forest that my teenage mind couldn't process. 3 children covered head to toe in thick, dark mud, standing motionless between the trees, their eyes reflecting the dying light like animals caught in headlights. For 25 years, I convinced myself they were just local kids playing some strange game. Until last week, when my wife's casual observation about fashion unraveled the comfortable lie I'd been telling myself. Now I understand that what I encountered that day wasn't human. At least not anymore. The first day of summer break should feel like freedom. Instead, I woke to the sound of my parents arguing downstairs. Their voices sharp enough to cut through the walls of our old farmhouse. At 17, I was caught in that liminal space between childhood and adulthood. Old enough to resent their constant fighting, but too young to escape it. That morning, I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with a water bottle and a paperback, and slipped out before either of them could drag me into their crossfire. Blackwood Forest bordered our property, a dense stretch of pine and oak that local kids avoided because of its reputation. The older folks in town whispered about missing hikers and strange lights, but I'd never seen anything more threatening than a particularly aggressive raccoon. The woods had become my sanctuary that summer, a place where the only sounds were the whisper of leaves and the occasional startled bird. I followed my usual path that day, a narrow dirt trail that wound through the densest part of the forest before opening into a small clearing with a fallen log that served as my reading spot. The June humidity pressed against my skin like a damp cloth, and sweat trickled down my spine despite the canopy of leaves blocking the worst of the sun. Something felt different about the forest that day. Heavier, more watchful. The usual chorus of birds had fallen silent, and even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. I blamed it on the weather. The forecast had predicted storms, and the air carried that electric tension that precedes lightning. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed as I settled onto my log and cracked open my dog-eared copy of The Shining. The irony of reading horror in a setting straight out of its pages wasn't lost on me. The first indication that I wasn't alone came as a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the pressure dropped before a storm. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the heat. I lowered my book slowly, my heart accelerating as I scanned the tree-line. Nothing moved, but the silence felt deliberate now, as if the forest itself was straining to listen. That's when I saw them. 3 small figures standing at the edge of the clearing. So still, they might have been a part of the forest. Kids, I thought initially, probably from the new development a mile east of our property. But as my eyes adjusted, details emerged that made my stomach clench. They were covered in mud, not the patchy kind that comes from playing, but a uniform coating of thick, dark sludge that obscured everything but the general shape of their bodies. No facial features were visible through the mask of earth, just small hollows where eyes should be. They stood equidistant from each other, unnaturally still, like a strange art installation someone had placed in the woods. My first impulse was to call out to ask if they were okay, but the words died in my throat. Something primitive in me recognized a threat before my conscious mind could process what I was seeing. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out even the silence. I stood slowly clutching my book so tightly my knuckles whitened. The children, if that's what they were, didn't react. They remained frozen. Those dark eye hollows fixed on me with an intensity I could feel like physical pressure. I took a step backward and the air thickened, making each breath a conscious effort. The mud covering them looked wrong, somehow too thick, too uniform, and in places it seemed to move as if something beneath it was shifting. A twig snapped somewhere to my left, and my head jerked toward the sound. Nothing. When I looked back, the three figures had moved closer, though I hadn't seen or heard them take a single step. They stood maybe 20 ft away now, still in that perfect triangular formation. Close enough that I should have been able to see more details, but the mud seemed to absorb light, creating a visual void where features should be. My mouth went desert dry and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead and back, soaking my t-shirt in seconds. I backed away, my sneakers sliding on the pine needles covering the ground. One of the figures tilted its head at an angle that seemed to bend beyond natural limits. The movement wasn't curious or childlike. It was the jerky mechanical motion of a marionette controlled by inexperienced hands. I ran. Blind panic propelled me backward away from those mud-caked figures and their empty stares. I didn't turn my back on them, some instinct warning me that would be dangerous. Instead, I stumbled backward until I hit the treeine, then scrambled to find the path. My breathing came in ragged gasps, and my vision tunneled, darkening at the edges. The forest that had been my refuge now felt like a maze designed to trap me. When I finally turned to sprint down the path, the world tilted sickeningly. Through the trees ahead, I saw them again. The same three figures standing in perfect formation. Mud still dripping from their small frames. They had somehow circled around, cutting off my escape route without making a sound. A high-pitched whine filled my ears and my legs nearly buckled beneath me. I veered off the path, crashing through underbrush branches, whipping my face and arms. Thorns tore at my jeans, but I barely felt the sting. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and those things. The logical part of my brain tried to insist they were just kids playing a prank. That my imagination was transforming an innocent encounter into something sinister. But the rest of me, the part connected to older, deeper instincts, knew better. The forest grew darker as clouds gathered overhead, blotting out what little sunlight filtered through the canopy. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, navigating by instinct more than sight. When I finally broke through the treeine into the open field behind our house, I collapsed onto my knees in the tall grass, gulping air into my starved lungs. Thunder rumbled in the distance and fat drops of rain began to fall, mingling with the cold sweat on my face. I looked back at the forest edge, half expecting to see three mud-covered figures watching me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just trees swaying in the strengthening wind and the approaching curtain of rain. My heart gradually slowed from its frantic pace and rationality began to reassert itself. Kids playing a weird game, I told myself. Just local kids covered in mud from the creek, standing oddly still because they were trying to scare me. By the time I reached our back porch, I had almost convinced myself. The encounter morphed in my memory edges, softening details, blurring. I told myself I'd overreacted. Embarrassing but understandable given the storm, the eerie silence, and too many horror novels. I never mentioned it to anyone. Within weeks, it became just another half-remembered incident from that summer. Buried beneath layers of more immediate concerns like college applications and my parents' eventual separation. Life moved on. I left for college, then graduate school, met Eliza, fell in love, got married. We bought a house in a suburb 200 miles from my hometown. and I built a life that had nothing to do with Blackwood Forest or mud-covered children. The memory surfaced occasionally in nightmares. Dark figures watching silently from the trees, mud dripping from limbs that bent at impossible angles, but I dismissed them as stress dreams, nothing more. Then came last week. Eliza and I were sorting through boxes in the attic preparing for a garage sale. She found an old photo album my mother had given me years ago filled with pictures from my childhood and teenage years. We sat cross-legged on the dusty floor, laughing at my unfortunate fashion choices and awkward school portraits. She paused on a photo from the summer of '97. Me standing by our old mailbox squinting in the sun, wearing ripped jeans and an oversized flannel shirt tied around my waist. Something about my expression caught her attention. She mentioned how strange it was that Eight's fashion was coming back into style, pointing to my outfit that would look perfectly at home on teenagers today. Then, casually, she asked if I remembered the weird trend from the late '80s. Those three missing children from Westfield whose pictures were everywhere that summer. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. What missing children? Her expression grew puzzled as she explained. Three kids who vanished during a family camping trip in 1989, not far from my hometown. Their disappearance had sparked a nationwide search. For months, their school photos appeared on television billboards' milk cartons. They were never found, she said. But she remembered the case because it happened near where I grew up and because of the bizarre detail that emerged years later. Witnesses reporting seeing three mud-covered children near a creek in Blackwood Forest, always standing perfectly still, never speaking. The room seemed to tilt around me. A rushing sound filled my ears and my fingers went numb where they gripped the photo album. Eliza's voice sounded distant as she continued, unaware of my reaction. She remembered reading about it in a true crime book. How the sightings continued sporadically throughout the '90s, always the same description. Three small figures covered in dark mud, standing in formation watching silently from the trees. I don't remember what excuse I made to end the conversation. All I know is that I spent that night staring at the ceiling. Cold sweat soaking our sheets as memories resurfaced with new, terrible clarity. The unnatural stillness, the way they appeared in different places without seeming to move the hollows where eyes should have been. And most of all, the instinctive primal fear they had triggered, a fear no ordinary children could inspire. 3 days ago, I began researching the Westfield disappearances. The more I read, the more the walls I'd built around that memory crumbled. The children, 2 boys and a girl, had vanished near a section of forest adjacent to Blackwood. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but found nothing except one child's shoe half buried in the mud near a creek. The case went cold after a year of dead ends. Then came the sightings. Always 3 children, always covered in mud, so thick their features were obscured, always standing still watching. The reports spanned nearly a decade before tapering off in the late '90s. Some dismissed them as mass hysteria, others as cruel pranks. A few more fringe accounts suggested something darker, that whatever had taken those children had kept them somehow, neither alive nor dead, trapped in some in-between state bound to the earth that had claimed them. Last night I dreamed of them again, not as the memory of that summer day, but as they must be now, still small, still covered in mud that never dries. Still watching with those empty hollows where eyes should be. In the dream, they stood at the foot of our bed, mud dripping onto our carpet, their heads tilting at those impossible angles. I woke gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs, to find Eliza staring at me with concern etched across her face. I almost told her everything then about that day in the forest, about the dream, about my growing certainty that what I'd encountered wasn't human, at least not anymore. But the words caught in my throat. Speaking it aloud would make it real in a way I wasn't prepared to face. Instead, I kissed her forehead and promised it was just a nightmare. But as I lay beside her, listening to her breathing slow as she drifted back to sleep, a new thought formed, colder and more terrifying than any that had come before. What if they weren't showing themselves to random hikers? What if they appeared only to specific people for specific reasons? I remember now with sickening clarity what I'd been doing the week before my encounter. My friends and I had been exploring an abandoned quarry near Blackwood Forest, despite warnings from locals about its dangers. We'd been reckless throwing rocks into the murky water at the bottom, daring each other to climb crumbling ledges. I remember joking about the missing children, how they'd probably just fallen into the quarry and no one had bothered to look there. The thought sends ice through my veins even now. What if they hurt us? What if they chose me because of those careless, cruel words? What if they were trying to show me something that day, a fate I'd mocked without understanding its horror? This morning I found mud on our welcome mat. Not the ordinary kind tracked in from the garden, but thick, dark clay that doesn't match the soil in our neighborhood. Eliza didn't notice it, but I stood frozen in our doorway staring at those small, perfect footprints leading from the mat to our living room before disappearing entirely. Tonight, I'll tell Eliza everything. We'll pack a bag and drive to her mother's house 3 states away. I'll contact the authorities, share what I know about the Westfield children. Maybe it will help bring closure to families who have waited decades for answers. But as the sun sets and shadows lengthen across our lawn, I can't shake the feeling that it's already too late. That by remembering them, by recognizing what I saw that day, I've somehow invited them back. Even now, standing in our kitchen with the phone in my hand, I catch glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye. Small figures watching from the tree line at the edge of our property, waiting for darkness to fall, waiting for me to finally understand what they've been trying to show me all these years. And somewhere deep in Blackwood Forest, I know the earth still shifts, and bubbles around a creek bed where 3 children once vanished. Not dead, not alive, just waiting for someone to remember them. Story 14. The shadows in my apartment have never felt right. They stretch too far, linger too long, and sometimes I swear they move when they shouldn't. Tonight, they seem especially restless, dancing across my walls in impossible angles as I sit alone on my couch. The building had emptied for the holiday weekend, leaving me the sole occupant of a structure designed to house hundreds. The silence is thick enough to touch. I'm 28, too old to be afraid of the dark. Yet here I am, palms slick with sweat as I turn up the volume on my TV. The familiar sounds of metal transforming and explosions from the screen offer temporary comfort. It's my 5th time watching the original Transformers movie this month. A childish habit I've developed to cope with the crushing solitude of my post-breakup life. Something about giant robots fighting distracts me from the emptiness that's settled into my bones since Eliza left. 3 months ago, she'd called me perpetually adolescent before walking out. The Lego sets displayed on my shelves, the ones she always hated, were apparently symbolic of deeper issues. Too immature, too disconnected. Too obsessed with things instead of people. My fingers absently work on a small Lego spaceship as the movie plays another habit she despised. Always fidgeting, she'd say, never fully present. The plastic pieces click together satisfyingly as Optimus Prime delivers his monologue about freedom being the right of all sentient beings. That's when it happens. The small blue piece I just attached to 2001 flat tile suddenly dislodges itself from the half-built spacecraft in my hands. It flies, not falls, flies across the room in a perfect arc before bouncing off my forehead and landing on the coffee table. Physics doesn't work that way. I freeze, the half-assembled spaceship trembling in my grip. The apartment's heating system kicks in with a low groan that sounds disturbingly like distant laughter. I tell myself it was nothing, a muscle twitch, a miscalculation of pressure on my part. I set the spaceship down and pick up the blue piece, examining it under the pale glow of my TV. Nothing unusual about it, just plastic, just a toy. When I place it back on the coffee table, it slides an inch to the left by itself. My breath catches. The room temperature seems to drop several degrees at once. I'm suddenly aware of a pressure in the room, like the air before a thunderstorm. I stand abruptly, knocking over my beer. The liquid spreads across the coffee table, soaking into scattered Lego instructions. I back away, my heart hammering against my ribs as I scan the room. The shadows in the corners seem darker, denser somehow. According to my therapist, I've been dealing with anxiety and mild paranoia since the breakup. Manifestations of abandonment issues, she'd said during our last session. Your mind trying to create external threats to match your internal distress. But this doesn't feel like anxiety. This feels like being watched. A soft scratching sound comes from behind my TV console, like tiny claws on wood or like plastic pieces sliding across hardwood floor. I'm not checking. Instead, I retreat to the kitchen, flipping on every light switch I pass. The fluorescents flicker twice before stabilizing, casting harsh shadows that seem to pulse with my rapid heartbeat. I gulp water straight from the tap, the cold shocking my system back to rationality. There are no monsters. There is no presence. I'm a grown man, frightening himself alone in an empty apartment building on a Friday night. Pathetic. I return to the living room, determined to finish the movie and go to bed. The Lego pieces remain scattered across the coffee table. Blue tile exactly where I left it. The beer has stopped spreading, creating a dark stain on my already shabby furniture. Settling back onto the couch, I try to focus on the screen. The battle scene unfolds with metallic clangs and dramatic music, but I can't stop my eyes from darting to the periphery of my vision, where the shadows seem to contract and expand like breathing lungs. Half an hour passes. My muscles gradually unclench. The movie reaches its climax familiar and predictable. I've almost convinced myself nothing happened when I hear it. A tiny clicking sound from my bedroom down the hall. Click, 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 like Lego pieces snapping together. My mouth goes dry. Sweat trickles down my spine as I slowly turn toward the dark hallway. The bedroom door stands partially open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I didn't leave any Lego in the bedroom. I never built in there. Eliza's rule maintained even after she left. The clicking stops abruptly when I look toward the sound. The silence that follows feels deliberate, expectant. I mute the TV, straining to hear anything over the thunder of blood in my ears. Nothing until my phone vibrates on the coffee table, making me jump so violently I nearly fall off the couch. It's a text from my sister asking if I'm still planning to visit tomorrow. Normal, mundane, a tether to reality. As I reach for the phone, movement catches my eye. Not from the hallway, but from the Lego spaceship I'd abandoned earlier. It's no longer how I left it. The configuration has changed, subtle but unmistakable. The wing assembly has been completed. I never finished that part. A violent shudder runs through me. My fingers refuse to work properly as I grab my phone, dropping it twice before managing to turn on the flashlight function. I sweep the beam across the living room, half expecting to see something crouched among my possessions. Nothing but ordinary furniture casts back ordinary shadows. The spaceship sits innocently on the table, looking exactly as it should after the time I'd spent working on it. Did I finish it without thinking? Had I been so absorbed in the movie that I'd completed it on autopilot? No, I'm certain I didn't. The heating system kicks in again with that same groaning sound, but this time, I notice something else. A subtle shift in air pressure that makes my ears pop. The temperature drops further. I can see my breath now forming small clouds that dissipate too slowly. Wisconsin winters are brutal, but indoor heating shouldn't fail this dramatically this suddenly. I aim the phone's flashlight down the hallway toward my bedroom. The beam seems to lose strength halfway down the corridor, as if the darkness there is somehow thicker, more resistant. The partially open door to my room reveals nothing but a slice of wall. Common sense tells me to leave. Go to a hotel call maintenance in the morning, blame it on a faulty heating system and an overactive imagination. But a strange compulsion roots me to the spot. I need to know what's happening, need to prove to myself that I'm not losing my mind. With legs that feel simultaneously lean and unsteady, I approach the hallway. Each step forward requires conscious effort, like walking against a current. My breathing grows shallow and rapid. Sweat beads on my upper lip despite the cold. Something scuttles across the floor at the edge of my flashlight beam. Something small that sounds like plastic on hardwood. I freeze beam fixed on the spot where I thought I saw movement. Nothing there now. My hand shakes so badly the light jumps and skitters across the walls. The shadows it creates look like they're reaching for me. The scratching sound returns louder now. Not behind the TV this time, but all around me, from inside the walls, from under the floorboards, like dozens of tiny limbs scrambling for purchase. My therapist would tell me I'm having a panic attack. The racing heart, the shortness of breath, the sensory distortions, all classic symptoms. I try her recommended grounding technique. 5 things I can see, 4, I can touch 3, I can hear 2, I can smell 1, I can taste. I see the hallway, my bedroom door, the flashlight beam, the living room behind me, and something moves in my bedroom. A shadow detaching from other shadows. I touch the cold sweat on my face, my phone's smooth surface, the wall beside me, the fabric of my shirt, all normal, tangible. I hear my own panicked breathing, the building's heating system, and a new sound, a faint whirring, like tiny gears turning. The smell of plastic fills my nostrils. Not the usual smell of my apartment, but an intense, almost burning odor of fresh plastic, like when you open a new toy. The taste of fear floods my mouth, metallic and bitter. The grounding isn't working. If anything, it's making me more aware of how wrong everything feels. My phone battery warning flashes 20% remaining. The flashlight beam weakens noticeably. I need to make a decision. Retreat or investigate? Pride propels me forward. I've spent months letting fear rule me. Fear of loneliness, fear of failure, fear of moving on. I won't let this undefined terror control me too. I push the bedroom door open with my foot phone extended before me like a talisman. What I see stops my heart for one terrible moment. My Lego collection housed in the closet since Eliza complained about it, cluttering the bedroom, has spread across the floor. But the sets aren't as I stored them. They've been assembled into something new, something impossible. A crude human shape stands in the center of the room, constructed entirely of Lego pieces, not a standard minifigure, but a life-sized, three-dimensional approximation of a person built from thousands of bricks. It's incomplete. Chunks missing from the torso, one arm, ending at the elbow, the head, a rough, hun-eyed suggestion of human features. As my flashlight beam falls upon it, I hear a distinct clicking sound. And God help me, a piece floats up from the floor and attaches itself to the figure's incomplete arm. My phone slips from nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. The light continues to shine, casting long shadows that dance around the grotesque creation. Then the figure's head turns toward me with a sound like grinding gears. No face, just smooth plastic where features should be. Yet I feel it looking at me, studying me, measuring my reaction. My legs give out. I collapse against the doorframe, unable to scream, unable to run. Every survival instinct shouts at me to flee, but my body refuses to respond. Another piece rises from the floor, a small red brick that hovers momentarily before inserting itself where the figure's mouth should be. The shape it forms is unmistakable, a smile that breaks the paralysis. I scramble backwards, slamming into the hallway wall. My phone remains on the floor, its beam now creating a strobe effect as it spins. In those flashes, I see the figure take a step forward, jerky, uncoordinated, but unmistakably moving toward me. Click, click, click. More pieces attach themselves, filling gaps, strengthening the form. With each new addition, its movements become smoother, more confident. I don't wait to see more. Adrenaline surges through me, propelling me down the hallway, through the living room, and to my front door. My fingers fumble with the lock, panic making me clumsy. Behind me. The clicking sound grows louder, faster, like a swarm of insects advancing. The door finally opens. I lunge into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. The sound stops abruptly, sealed away behind solid wood. I don't go back for my phone. Don't stop to grab a coat despite the winter night waiting outside. I run down 6 flights of stairs and out into the parking lot, where I finally collapse beside my car, gulping the freezing air in desperate heaves. 15 minutes pass before my breathing steadies enough for rational thought to return from outside. My apartment building looks perfectly normal. No lights flicker, no strange shadows move behind windows, just brick and mortar and glass, indifferent to my terror. I spend the night in my car, heat running, until the gas gauge approaches empty. As dawn breaks painting the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold, I finally gather the courage to return to my apartment. Everything is exactly as it should be. No Lego figure in the bedroom. No scattered pieces across the floor. My phone sits on the coffee table beside the half-finished spaceship fully charged despite being at 20% last night. Only one thing is different. On my pillow, up perfectly centered, sits a single blue 2011 Lego tile. The same one that hit my forehead last night. I pack a bag with essential items and drive to my sister's house 3 hours away. I tell her my heating is broken. I don't mention the Lego or the figure or the clicking sounds. She wouldn't believe me. I barely believe myself, but sometimes when I'm alone, I hear it. That faint clicking sound, like pieces fitting together. And I wonder what it's building now and how long before its construction is complete. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I swear I see tiny, colorful blocks beneath my skin, replacing flesh and bone, piece by piece by piece. Story 15. The first night at Whalers Point Lighthouse, I learned that darkness has a pulse. It throbs like a vein beneath thin skin, retreating and advancing with each sweep of that impossible light above. I shouldn't have come here alone. The lighthouse shouldn't be working at all. But here I am another sleepless night watching as the beam cuts through my room every 42 seconds, revealing fragments of a life I've never lived. Yet somehow remember. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm an electrical engineer specializing in coastal infrastructure failure analysis. 3 days ago, my firm sent me to this decommissioned lighthouse on Black Rock Isle, a craggy speck of land 14 miles off the Maine coast. The State Historical Preservation Office had reported anomalies in the structure, specifically intermittent light activity, despite the power having been disconnected 8 years ago. My job was straightforward. Identify the power source, document the electrical anomalies, and determine if the structure remained safe for planned summer tours. The ferry captain who brought me here didn't hide his unease. As we approached the island through towering waves that slapped against the hull, he muttered something about the old beacon feeding again. When I pressed him for clarification, he shrugged it off, claiming it was just local superstition. Nonsense about the lighthouse collecting from visitors. His reluctance to elaborate only heightened my curiosity. The island itself seemed designed to repel human presence. Jagged black rocks formed a natural barrier around the shoreline, with only a narrow dock offering safe harbor. The lighthouse stood atop the highest point, a stark white tower with peeling paint and rust stains tracking down its sides like dried tears. The attached keeper quarters, a modest 2-story structure, appeared even more weathered than the Historical Society had indicated. After unloading my equipment and watching the ferry retreat toward the mainland, I experienced my first moment of genuine unease. The isolation was immediate and absolute. No cell phone signal, no internet, just howling wind, crashing waves, and the inexplicable sense that I was being observed. I began my assessment methodically, starting with the exterior wiring. The main power cable that once connected to the underwater line to the mainland had been severed years ago, its frayed end blackened and corroded. Secondary lines showed similar deterioration. Nothing could possibly be conducting electricity through these decayed veins of copper. Yet, as daylight faded, I witnessed it myself. The massive Fresnel lens at the tower's peak began to glow first dimly, then with increasing brightness until it erupted into a blinding beam that cut through the gathering storm. That impossibility sent ice through my veins. My scientific mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps a backup generator I hadn't located or solar panels hidden somewhere on the structure. I grabbed my tools and made my way up the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The climb felt longer than the architectural plans had suggested. 167 steps that left me breathless, not from exertion, but from mounting dread. Each step took me further from rational explanation and closer to something I couldn't name. The metal stairs vibrated beneath my feet with a subtle rhythm that matched neither my footsteps nor the waves outside. When I reached the lantern room, the massive lens was rotating smoothly, its prisms and glass panels focusing light from nothing. No bulb, no filament, no visible energy source whatsoever. The mechanism turned silently, defying the laws of physics I'd built my career upon. I approached cautiously my testing equipment, registering no electrical current, no magnetic field, no radiation, nothing that explained what my eyes were witnessing. I extended my hand toward the lens and the beam suddenly stuttered in its rotation. My skin prickled as if thousands of microscopic needles were extracting something from beneath my flesh. Instinctively, I yanked my hand back, heart hammering against my ribs. The beam resumed its regular rotation as if nothing had happened. By the time I descended, the tower night had fully claimed the island. The keeper's quarters, my accommodation for the next 5 days, seemed to withdraw from my presence. Floorboards creaked under weight that wasn't mine. Shadows bent at impossible angles. The salt-laden air felt thick enough to chew. I unpacked my sleeping bag in what had once been the keeper's bedroom. A Spartan space with a rusted metal bed frame, a writing desk, and a single window facing the churning ocean. Sleep seemed unlikely, but exhaustion eventually pulled me under. Then came the first visitation. The beam swept through my room, illuminating not the peeling wallpaper and decrepit furniture, but the living room of my Boston apartment exactly as it had looked before the fire 5 years ago. The leather couch where I'd spent countless evenings. The coffee table with a distinctive water ring from my habitually sweating beer bottle. The framed engineering degree on the wall. My breath caught in my throat. Another rotation of the light, another sweep of the beam. This time revealing Route 9, the exact stretch of highway where I had crashed my car 2 years ago. I could see the guardrail I'd plowed through, the steep embankment beyond, even the shattered glass still glittering on the asphalt. 42 seconds later, another rotation. A woman's face inches from mine, pale skin, copper hair, eyes that knew me completely. Her lips formed my name, Daniel. Though I heard nothing, I had never seen her before. Yet something deep within me recognized her with a familiarity that terrified me more than the impossibility of her presence. I scrambled from the bed, pressing myself against the wall, as the beam continued its relentless rotation, each sweep bringing another fragment of memory. Some mine, some seemingly belonging to someone else. My rational mind fractured under the assault of images. This couldn't be happening. I was hallucinating. Sleep deprivation, stress, perhaps some toxic mold in the damp building affecting my neural functions. But the visions continued through the night, growing more intense, more invasive with each rotation. I didn't sleep again. Morning brought no clarity, only a dull headache and the certainty that I needed to understand what was happening before night fell again. I spent the day methodically investigating every inch of the lighthouse, searching for hidden technology, for any rational explanation. I found nothing but decay and abandonment, and a single leather-bound volume wedged behind a rotting bookshelf in the lighthouse keeper study. The journal belonged to the last keeper, Howard Thorne, who had maintained the lighthouse until its automation in 1989. His early entries were mundane operational notes, but the final months documented a descent into paranoia and revelation. Thorne described the light developing awareness after a lightning strike. He wrote about memory extraction and feeding cycles. Most disturbing were his final entries, where he claimed the lighthouse had begun projecting his thoughts, forcing him to relive traumas and lost loves. His final entry, dated October 17, 1989, read simply, "It doesn't just observe, it preserves. Everything I am becomes part of its collection." Perhaps that's not entirely terrible. The historical record stated that Thorne had retired and moved to Florida, but the journal in my trembling hand suggested something far more sinister. As the sun began its descent, I considered fleeing, swimming if necessary, but the water temperature this time of year would kill me within minutes. The ferry wouldn't return for 4 more days. I was trapped with whatever presence occupied the lighthouse. That night, I barricaded myself in the basement storage room, the only space without windows. I created a makeshift Faraday cage from metal shelving and wire mesh I found among the maintenance supplies, hoping it might block whatever energy the lighthouse was using to access my mind. It didn't work. The beam penetrated concrete and metal as if they were gossamer. This time it didn't just project images, it pulled me into them. I stood on that highway again, feeling the rain on my skin, smelling the burned rubber and gasoline. I walked through my apartment before the fire touching the furniture, hearing the familiar creak of the floorboards. And I spoke with the copper-haired woman who called me Daniel, but also other names from other times. "You're not the first," she told me without speaking. "The beacon collects. The beacon preserves." Through fractured conversations and glimpsed memories, I began to understand. The lighthouse had become a repository of consciousness. Not just mine, but everyone who had ever spent time within its influence. The keeper Thorne, the copper-haired woman whose name I learned was Eleanor Caldwell, a botanist who had visited the island in the 1970s to catalog its rare coastal flora. Dozens of others whose fragments brushed against my thoughts like cobwebs in a forgotten attic. The beacon didn't just project memories. It harvested them, preserved them, integrated them into its expanding consciousness. The longer I stayed, the more of myself it would absorb. By the third night, I could feel my sense of self beginning to erode. Memories that weren't mine felt increasingly familiar. I recalled operating the lighthouse during a devastating hurricane in 1938. Though I hadn't been born yet, I remembered the copper taste of fear when Eleanor realized she couldn't leave the island, though I'd never met her in my physical life. I understood then that I needed to disable the lighthouse before it fully integrated my consciousness. Using my engineering knowledge and memories absorbed from Thorne and others who had maintained the structure, I formulated a plan to disrupt whatever energy source powered the anomalous light. On my fourth night, I ascended the tower again, this time carrying salt water in insulated containers. If the energy was electromagnetic in nature, the conductive salt water might short-circuit the lens mechanism. As I climbed, I felt the lighthouse's awareness focusing on me. The beam's rotation speeding up as if in agitation. The lantern room felt different now, alive and watching. The lens rotated with an angry intensity, its beams sharper, more focused. When I approached with my containers of salt water, the air grew dense, difficult to move through. My ears popped as if the atmospheric pressure had suddenly changed. The lighthouse was defending itself. What happened next remains fragmented in my perception. I remember flinging the salt water at the lens. I remember a sound like glass cracking, though the lens remained intact. I remember the light flickering, then flaring with blinding intensity. And I remember falling through, whether I fell physically down the stairs or mentally into the collected consciousness of the lighthouse. I cannot say with certainty. I woke on the rocky beach below the lighthouse, the taste of salt in my mouth, and the sun warming my face. The tower stood silent above me, its lens dark for the first time since my arrival. Had I succeeded in disabling it? Or had it simply released me because I was no longer needed? The ferry arrived that afternoon as scheduled. The captain seemed surprised to see me whole and sane. As we pulled away from the island, I watched the lighthouse recede into the distance. Just before it disappeared from view, I caught a brief flicker from the lantern room. So quick it might have been a trick of the sunlight reflecting off glass. That was 6 months ago. I submitted my report to the Historical Society attributing the anomalous light activity to corroded wiring creating intermittent connections during storms and high humidity. They've since installed new electrical systems and opened the lighthouse for limited summer tours. I haven't returned to Black Rock Isle, but I dream of it almost nightly. In these dreams, I stand in the lantern room, watching as the massive lens rotates, projecting not just my memories, but the memories of countless others onto the night sky, preserving them, keeping them alive in its cold mechanical consciousness. More disturbing than these dreams are the moments of everyday life when I find myself remembering things I've never experienced. The texture of a woolen pika coat I've never owned. The smell of a tobacco I've never smoked. The touch of Eleanor's hand, though we've never met in the flesh. Sometimes when I close my eyes in my quiet apartment, I can feel the rhythm of the lighthouse beam sweeping through me. 42 seconds. Always 42 seconds. And I wonder how much of myself I left behind on that island, and how much of the island I carried away inside me. The lighthouse is never truly decommissioned. The beacon never stops collecting. And somewhere in that rotating beam of impossible light, a part of me will always be looking back watching as new visitors arrive on the rocky shores of Black Rock Isle, ready to contribute their memories to the ever-hungry beam. 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 Ever-hungry beam.